Chapter 161, New Runes. While Percy prided himself as a relatively fast reader, he was operating under a strict self-imposed time limit during this visit. Naturally, he couldn't afford to carefully read all 7 of the volumes he'd just bought. Luckily, he didn't need to either. Obviously, he had no intention of learning hundreds of variants of the new runes. He just had to pick the ones most suitable for his current needs. Consequently, he devoted the first few days of his reading time to skimming over the books, identifying the best candidates. The preservation rune had a circular shape in general, like most of the vault's enchantments, though it differed slightly from the concealment rune he'd previously mastered. It was made of 2 concentric circles, down from 3, though it contained many more curved lines linking the 2 shapes. Each subvariant differed some more from the general case, altering the properties of the enchantment subtly, to make it more suitable for specific applications or mana types. In the end, Percy found 13 variants in total that could be used with soul mana to do what he wanted. But only 4 of them work with other mana types too. What if I draw them using my fused mana? Can I get them to work on both souls and corporeal objects at the same time? Percy was confident it should work, though it wouldn't be without cost. According to the book, the less specialized the rune was, the lower its efficiency would be in each area, which frankly made sense. Picking a variant suitable for multiple tasks would make its effect about 10–15% less potent. It's not that bad. All things considered, it's a small price to pay for versatility. At least, it's better than wasting my time learning 2 separate variants. Beyond that, there were a few more factors to take into consideration. For example, he had to pick a variant that could be overlapped with other runes in general, and his own concealment runes in particular. This would make his life easier later, once he graduated from basic runecrafting and started working on composing the runes together into more complex enchantments. Suffice to say, it took a fair amount of head-scratching, but Percy eventually settled on a variant he deemed to be the best match for his needs. Maybe I could pick a better one if I spent more time on it, but this should be good enough for now. He nodded in satisfaction. Percy wasn't a Magiscript expert, nor was he that well-versed in the vault's runes. He understood his decision-making process was probably full of blind spots, but he figured he'd done a decent job given the circumstances. Perhaps he could revisit this in the future once he was more experienced and had the credits to splurge. Next, he spent the rest of the week practicing with the new rune. Memorizing the shape and getting used to drawing it accurately was a laborious process. That said, it was notably easier the second time around. The more runes he learned, the more he would familiarize himself with the vault's language, and the more skilled he'd grow in drawing them precisely. Sadly, he couldn't test the enchantment's effect on souls just yet, as his limited stash of fused mana wasn't enough for that. However, he could at least tap into the more general effects of the rune by drawing it with earth mana. That should be enough to get him through the challenge. 10 days, he grimaced. Getting to an acceptable level with the preservation rune took him a bit longer than he would have liked. It was still within the allotted 2 weeks, but it didn't leave him much time to learn the other one. At least not without extending his trip by a little. Oh well, can't be helped. I need a 3rd rune to get through the wave. Also, Nesh's progress is going to stall if I don't bring this back to Remir. Fortunately, the control rune was easier to learn than the others. In fact, it was by far the simplest rune he'd ever seen. It was only made of a single circle with a cross inside it. There wasn't much to memorize, and even drawing it was trivial. This story has been taken without authorization. Report any sightings. Using it, on the other hand, was where the problem lay. After all, the control rune wasn't supposed to be used on its own. Its enchantment allowed it to be turned on and off at will. The person who inscribed it could do that remotely, though anybody could use it by pouring their mana into it. That said, the effect was only valuable once it was combined with a different rune. Normally, combining runes fell under the field of Magiscript, not runecrafting. However, the control rune was much easier to overlap with other runes due to its simplicity, allowing even a novice like Percy to accomplish this. Still, it wasn't exactly trivial either, as the scribe had to visualize 2 distinct effects while drawing the composite rune, while also keeping their joint function at the forefront of their mind. I guess it's something I'll have to learn sooner or later anyway, he sighed. The good news was that he didn't need to do that right now. A quick test confirmed the challenge accepted the control rune when drawn separately. This meant he could learn to combine it with the other runes later, after he returned to Remir. Even better, both his drawing speed and his success rate would skyrocket if he used the control rune to fill the bulk of his quota. He still had to draw 50 concealment runes and 50 preservation runes, but the remaining 200 would be a piece of cake. Meeting all the cube's requirements did take a while, but he managed to do it by the end of his 4th week in the vault. Enchantments: Control, General, Variant number 172. Concealment, General, Preservation, Soul Specialized, Variant number 31. Difficulty 1. Runes drawn 300. Time taken 5,923 writs. Success rate 95%. Score adjusted due to difficulty 95%. Finally, congratulations! Wave 3 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits 90. Current balance 160. Percy couldn't help but grin as he saw his balance hit the triple digits for the first time. This was already enough to buy several more books, though he didn't know how expensive the spell he was interested in would be. Gabe was trying to buy a fire spell using a bonus reward back when we first met. This meant that at least some spells were either prohibitively expensive or only obtainable from the restricted lists. Then again, Gabe had probably been looking for a refined spell, or maybe even higher. Percy would be happy with a crude one, as long as it did what he wanted. He could improve it later. Let's try earning as many credits as I can first. I'll browse the database afterwards. Next, Percy started the 4th wave. He seriously doubted he'd be able to clear it anytime soon, though he figured it was worth checking the requirements anyway, for future reference. Draw any 10 runes 1,000 times in total in under 15,000 writs, with at least a 95% success rate. Each individual rune has to be drawn at least 50 times. Wow! Talk about a steep difficulty curve. Becoming sufficiently proficient with 10 different runes was a project that could easily take half a year. It was a little disappointing, though it made sense. If Gabe's combat challenges were anything to go by, getting past the 4th wave required both a blessing and a bloodline. Of course, this wasn't the case for the Magiscript challenge, but its difficulty should scale in an equivalent manner. And this was still somewhat achievable, relatively speaking. Going by what Gabe had told him, the green level of the challenge involved proper applications of Magiscript, requiring decades of preparation. Sadly, I don't have any decades to spare right now, Percy smiled bitterly. In the end, reaching this point had taken him a little longer than his original estimates. Though he didn't regret it. At least, he'd already met the primary objectives of his trip. He and Nesha would have the means to continue progressing once he returned. As for any more runes, they'd have to wait for his next visit. For now, let's try to speedrun the combat challenges. He didn't know how far he'd get, but it would be a waste of his host's oversized body to not even try. He couldn't take his sweet time planning his approach like he'd originally intended, but he could still try earning all the easy credits. After that, he'd buy his prize and be on his merry way. Let's do it then. Cube. Start the Gauntlet Challenge. Red level. User ID Wanderer. Authorization granted. Choice confirmed. Wave begins in 18 writs. The soulless voice said. Percy stretched his limbs as the parrot awakened from his slumber. He brought the creature up to speed, hastily explaining what this challenge involved. Wave begins in 12 writs. Strictly speaking, the bird wasn't particularly accustomed to fighting. His life back in his home world had been relatively peaceful. Still, a wave of excitement seeped through their bond. Evidently, the parrot was so fed up with runecrafting by now that he was willing to do pretty much anything else. Wave begins in 6 writs. Soon, the familiar black sludge began pouring down the sleek walls. Percy grinned, finding it a little nostalgic. Time to pummel some golems. Wave begins. May your challenge be successful. Chapter 162, Farming Credits. Unlike the previous times, much less of the black liquid seeped out of the walls. A portion rolled down to the floor, the rest sticking to the cube's surfaces. Next, the material solidified, coating the room with a thin film of black. "That's a new one," Percy frowned. At least, the sack is still there. The sludge had merely flowed underneath his supplies, leaving them propped up against the wall. It was quite a relief. Percy would have been forced to rush through the challenges had the cube chosen to rob him of his only source of food. Scanning his surroundings, he searched for his opponent. Soon, his gaze landed on the only other object, a small orb the size of a tangerine, resting motionless in the middle of the room. "Is that the golem?" As if to answer his question, a series of red lines lit up all over the black sphere. Then, an indentation formed on the floor around it, a square tile sinking about an inch into the ground. "What the?" With a snapping sound, the tile sprung back at an angle, shooting the sphere at him at a dizzying speed. Percy barely raised his arms in time, shielding his face as the impact sent a jolt of pain through his bones, causing him to stumble backwards. But the assault didn't stop there, a second blow landing in his stomach the very next second, this time bringing him to his knees. Seriously? This is the first wave of the red level. Crouching, he tightened the guard around his face some more, bracing against the follow-up attacks. Sadly for him, the golem didn't even bother aiming for his head anymore, instead randomly slamming into his body from various angles. "It's okay. It hurts like a bitch. But it's not that dangerous." The realization comforted him a little, though he still winced every time the orb crashed into him. He'd have died already had his host been a smaller beast, or even a red humanoid for that matter. It was only due to the combination of his bulk, his beast affinity, and the second core that he could bear the attacks relatively unfazed. Still, he knew he had to fight back at some point if he wanted to get through the challenge. Unwilling to lift his eyes from the safety of his guard, Percy scanned the room with his mana sense, trying to locate the orb. The darn thing kept bouncing from one surface to another, making crisp sounds with each collision. It took Percy a couple minutes to adjust to the golem's speed. In the meantime, he had to endure several more blows, waiting patiently for his chance to catch the sphere. Fast as it was, he knew the flimsy construct wouldn't survive a second in his grasp. There! Once the golem was on course to collide against him head-on, he tried to grab it. Sadly, his host's poor reflexes let him down, the orb slipping right through his arms. It delivered yet another painful blow on his chest, knocking the breath out of his lungs. How annoying! Percy stubbornly kept at it for another hour, before accepting that he'd never catch the speedy golem with his bare hands. In fact, he even had the parrot try at some point, hoping the bird would do better than him. That didn't happen, the beast giving up too after a few failures. What about the earth mana? If he hardened the mana into stone, he could soften the blows some more. But he shook his head. Doing that would spare him some pain, but it wouldn't get him through the wave. Instead, he tried something different, pulling a sliver of mana from his abdomen. He formed a cushion of sand on his back, hoping to dampen the golem's momentum. After all, the cube had gone out of its way to prepare the room so that the orb could bounce around more easily. Clearly, it would have trouble doing so otherwise. Percy nodded, feeling happy about his plan. He thought it had a decent chance of working too. The execution left much to be desired, however. He messed the timing up, receiving another painful hit. The next few attempts didn't go much better either. Damn! This is going to take a while. Unauthorized tail usage. If you spot this story on Amazon, report the violation. Congratulations! Wave 1 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits 30. Current balance 190. Percy breathed heavily, not particularly happy about the outcome. In the end, his idea to stop the golem using sand worked, but not before several hours of poorly timed blocks and nasty blows. He was certain his body was bruised from head to toe, though that was partially hidden beneath whatever remained of his plumage. Either way, he wasn't particularly eager to start the next wave. His advantages might have protected him from any serious injuries this time around, but the challenge would only grow more brutal from here on out. That said, he knew he had to keep going. The sooner he started the next wave, the sooner his suffering would end. Maybe the swarm challenge will be easier? Congratulations! Wave 1 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits 30. Current balance 220. It wasn't. The golems in the swarm challenge fought in a similar manner, though each of them was much weaker and smaller. Each was only about as large as a pebble, but there were hundreds of them this time. Luckily, Percy's makeshift spell worked even better against the smaller golems. They sank into the cushion, making it easy for him to grab them and crush them between his claws, one at a time. Unfortunately, the wave refused to end until he destroyed every last one of them. A project that took him several hours and even more refills. Suffice to say, his second core's downtime wasn't pleasant for either him or the parrot. Whenever they were out of mana, they had to endure the painful pelting of the remaining orbs. Not looking forward to the next wave. Congratulations! Wave 2 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits 60. Current balance 280. Congratulations! Wave 2 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits 60. Current balance 340. Please, make it stop, Percy groaned, the parrot echoing the sentiment. He was lying face down in the middle of the room, his limbs sprawled out like a starfish. He did his best to not move a muscle, as even the slightest twitch was pure agony. There hadn't been any great surprises during the second waves of the combat challenges. The gauntlet had thrown a bigger, heavier golem at him, while the swarm had mostly increased the number of enemies rather than their individual strength. Still, Percy would have probably died if he hadn't grown more proficient in shielding himself with the earth mana over the last couple of days. So much for keeping the bodies in a good condition. He smiled bitterly. Metatron isn't going to be happy. Not that he could help it. If the Titan didn't like this, he shouldn't have made the challenges so damn hard. In any case, Percy had done a decent job getting this far, and he'd even collected a hefty number of credits, though one question remained. Do I keep going? He did kinda want to get all the challenges to the third wave. It wasn't just about the rewards either. Clearing the waves was oddly satisfying. Not to mention that he liked round numbers. Something about stopping here felt wrong. Oh well, I can always abort the challenge if it gets too dangerous. On another note, Percy had discovered that the translation device was a lot tougher than it looked. Admittedly, he discovered this by accident, after forgetting to take it off. It wasn't until a few days in he even remembered he was wearing it, after it had presumably eaten hundreds of blows. Naturally, his heart had skipped a bit upon realizing how close he'd come to ruining the expensive tool. Luckily, there wasn't a dent on it, prompting him to ask the cube about it. Apparently, it would take a blue-level attack to actually damage the device. I guess it makes sense. What kind of idiot would make a device costing 5,000 credits so fragile? In any case, Percy caught himself, realizing he was just procrastinating at this point. With a heavy heart, he started the third wave of the Swarm Challenge, hoping it would be more forgiving than the Gauntlet. Congratulations! Wave 3 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits 90. Current balance 430. Don't worry about it. Percy tried to console his host. The two were staring at their broken beak, lying on the ground by their feet. I'm sure Metatron will fix you as soon as I leave. What he wasn't quite as certain about was whether the Titan would be willing to honor their deal the next time he visited. But that was future Percy's problem. Congratulations! Wave 3 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits 90. Current balance 520. It's done. We've made it. Percy could hardly believe it. He dragged himself against the metallic floor using his one surviving talon, leaving a bloody trail behind him. His other 3 limbs weren't much help. Their joints bent in all the wrong directions. Eventually, he made it to the remains of the coconuts. By now, all that was left of them was a pink pool of pulp. The sack had mostly survived the gauntlet challenge intact, as the larger golem rarely hit his supplies. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said about the swarm challenge. Sighing, Percy picked the largest solid piece he could find, squeezing it between his claws, letting a few lukewarm droplets of juice fall into his broken beak. The liquid rolled down his throat, soon causing him to break into a cough. Crap! I forgot how salty they are. Not only was the exotic fruit terrible for quenching one's thirst, the salt only exacerbated Percy's injuries further, making him wince in pain. Denied of even this small relief, Percy turned over, resting with his back on the floor. At this point, he just wanted this trip to end. The past few days had been hellish, though the results spoke for themselves. There was one last thing he needed to do with all the credits he'd earned, before he could put himself and the parrot out of their shared misery. Cube, give me a list of crude mana conversion spells. Chapter 163, Mana Conversion. Percy had decided to look for a mana conversion spell as an alternative solution to his problem. He needed a lot of soul mana to lure the mysterious entities from much further away, and he only had two possible sources to tap into: his own recovery and Mickey's ability to devour souls. He was already planning to bolster the latter using the preservation rune he'd recently bought, but he was hoping to improve upon the former too. While he could regenerate soul mana very rapidly using synchronization, it also led to a lot of wasted pure mana that he didn't know what to do with. If he could find a way to convert some of that into soul mana, it would give him yet another potent source he could rely on. And there's no better place to browse for the right spell than the vault. He grinned. Strictly speaking, mana conversion wasn't some esoteric art. It was something all living beings passively did with every breath. After all, ambient mana was a mixture of many different affinities. This meant that only a fraction could be taken in directly. Of course, this fraction was the most significant by far, as it could be absorbed without losses. This was why a mage's recovery greatly depended on their environment. For example, a water user would struggle to refill their core in a desert, but they'd have a much easier time doing so in the middle of the ocean. However, that didn't mean the rest of the ambient mana was useless. Among their many functions, mana cores could also convert other mana types into their own, albeit at an abysmal rate. That said, some conversions were easier than others, and there were also two very special cases: the beast affinity and the pure affinity. Beasts could be considered universal recipients to an extent, because they could convert other affinities to their own more efficiently. This was, in fact, what they owed their ridiculous advancement speed to. Of course, it wasn't smooth sailing for them either. Ambient mana didn't contain the beast affinity, so they only had their higher conversion rate to rely on. This was why they still struggled to regenerate mana the conventional way, having to keep devouring cores instead. It was also why Mickey's version of circulation gnawed at his body, draining his stamina. On the other end of the spectrum, pure users were considered universal donors. Pure mana could be more easily converted to other types, which was the main principle behind the magic potions Percy had encountered in the Alchemist's Guild. It still wasn't particularly effective. A pure mage might have to empty their core to replenish about 20% of somebody else's reserves, though most of them learned how to do this at some point. It rarely mattered, but it wasn't like pure mana had that many uses to begin with. Maybe I can find something slightly better here than what we have on Remier. In the end, Percy spent some more time browsing through the database for anything suitable. He wasn't that surprised to learn that the system had even more on this topic than the runes he had searched for the other day. After all, the pure affinity was the most common in the universe, and this was a somewhat well-known application of it. The only reason he hadn't asked Baldy for something of the sort back when he was still at home was because it wouldn't have helped him much at the time. His second core had been a grade lower, which meant it would have given him almost nothing. Even now, he didn't think this would be a particularly useful ability to have in the midst of combat. He was better off just fusing his two affinities into the teal mana. However, it would certainly help a lot in some niche applications such as the very problem he was currently facing. Unauthorized usage. This narrative is on Amazon without the author's consent. Report any sightings. Let's see. Cube, which books have we singled out so far? Evaluating request. Evaluation complete. User has bookmarked a total of 6 items. Universal Donor, the advantage of pure mana. The 10 most efficient mana bestowal spells for beginners. Affinity-specific mana bestowal. Absorbing pure mana for non-pure users. Tips and tricks for soul users. Fundamentals for new mages. Total cost, 340 credits. Current balance, 520. Percy wasn't particularly happy with this. Apparently, books on spells, even crude ones, were several times more expensive than those on runes. He guessed that this disparity was artificially imposed by the gods in charge of the vault to make Magiscript a little more accessible, or to push people working on the combat challenges to try harder. Worse still, he'd found multiple books that interested him. As there seemed to be a little more to the spell he wanted to create than he'd initially expected. As it turned out, mana conversion could typically be broken into 2 parts: mana bestowal and mana absorption. As the names implied, they differed depending on whether one was the bestower or the recipient of the pure mana. The former was arguably the most important, but learning how to absorb the mana more effectively would make one a better patient, or so to speak. Furthermore, each conversion worked a little differently, so it was possible for a pure user to get better at supporting, say, fire mages if they practiced a lot with them. I mean, I don't have to buy all of them. Percy could just get the first spell he found, and it would still do all right. His conversion rate might not be great at the start, but he should be able to hit the target 20% after some practice. However, he felt it would be a waste of his talents if he didn't strive to do a little better. After all, he was in a unique position in that he was both the bestower and the recipient of the mana. He even knew what affinity he wanted to convert the mana to. That meant he could probably work out a very specialized spell that performed a lot better for him than anybody else. That's so many credits, though. Percy wanted to cry. He'd suffered through so much crap to amass this much, and he'd have to spend nearly 2/3 of it on this. Not to mention how unpleasant the next few days promised to be, assuming his broken body even lasted that long. He sighed. "I'm sorry, buddy. We'll have to soldier through the pain for a little longer." The parrot groaned in protest. Percy could tell how much his host missed his carefree days in the beach. But it couldn't be helped. If the preservation rune didn't get him enough soul mana to attract the creature, it would mean he'd wasted this entire trip. "Cube, buy all 6 books. And please narrate them for me too. I'm not in any condition to read." He smiled bitterly. "Also, do you have anything to dull my pain for a few days?" User ID Wanderer. Authorization granted. Evaluating request. Evaluation complete. Warning. Books may be purchased in audiobook format free of charge, but an additional charge will be added in the future if you wish to repurchase them in a different format. Proceed anyway. Ugh, what a stingy piece of shit you are. Just do it. Percy generally preferred holding a physical copy of his books, but he'd just have to forget about these ones later. No way he was spending more of his hard-earned credits than he had to. Confirmed. Deducting credits. New balance, 180. Evaluating request. Evaluation complete. Simple painkillers are valued at 1 credit per 30 pills. Each dose is effective for 18,000 writs. Proceed with purchase. Hearing the cost, Percy wanted to swear. He was starting to see how Gabe had turned so stingy. This wasn't a problem with his friend. It was just what this place did to people. After all, each credit cost so much blood and sweat to earn. Ultimately, he decided to pay the price, however. He could try gritting through the pain to save himself the credit, but it would just affect his ability to understand the books. Honestly, spending a credit to spare himself a week of agony wasn't that bad a deal. Fine. He spat with a heavy heart. Confirmed. Deducting credits. New balance. 179. Delivery in 6 writs. It only took a few seconds for the pills to be delivered, Percy eagerly tossing the first one down his throat as soon as he could. Then he asked the cube to begin narrating the books for him, hoping he'd get to the end before his body gave out. "I think I'm going to take a break from the vault for a few months." Chapter 164. Self-bestowal. "Another one," Mickey said, carrying an oversized rat carcass in his talons. The distraction caused Percy to mess up the rune he was trying to carve on the snake's body, prompting him to click his tongue in annoyance. Sighing, he shifted his attention to the new corpse, scanning it via mana sense. There was an orange star rapidly dimming in its sternum. "Mickey," I said, "yellow beasts only. I wish I could preserve all of them, but I don't have the time. At least, not while keeping up with my other tasks." Percy had way too much on his plate lately. Besides piling up the dead animals for their operation, he also had to brew elixirs for the group, to keep up the appearance of a professional blacksmith for the townsfolk, and to work on his new spell. Orange beasts just weren't worth the effort. They'd only give Mickey a fraction of the mana when the time came. "I'm trying." The bird cawed in annoyance. "Yellows are getting harder to find." "All right, just drop it in that circle for now. I'll mark it later if I have the time," Percy said, pointing at yet another preservation rune carved on the ground nearby. Shimmering in a faint teal color, it was much larger than those he drew on the creature's flesh. And it wasn't the only one. It was surrounded by dozens of similar circles. Most of them had yellow carcasses lying on them, only a handful having orange ones instead. Had somebody paid close attention to the bodies, they'd notice all of them were covered from head to toe with even more preservation runes. That said, Percy had run into diminishing returns after trying to double down on the enchantment. The runes he carved on the bodies already accounted for over 80% of the effect, so the additional circles underneath them were just icing on the cake. Still, he wanted to preserve every last drop of soul mana they could extract from the animals, to maximize the odds of his experiment working. 3 weeks had already passed since his return from the vault. He and Mickey had amassed over 30 corpses in that time. Sadly, a quick scan via soul vision revealed that the first souls were crumbling already, the silver flames over halfway gone. Such a waste, but it can't be helped. Evidently, even the specialized variant of the preservation rune he'd mastered had its limits. While it greatly delayed a soul's decay, it couldn't stop it entirely. It merely slowed down the process, stretching it to a little over a month. Still, their stash was already diminishing as fast as they were replenishing it, which meant they wouldn't gain anything by waiting any longer. Percy would have gone for it already, if there weren't a couple of things he was holding out on. "Are you sure House Tantalus hasn't simply given up on this place?" Nesha asked. It had already been over 2 months since they killed the most recent group of yellows. The enemy house had remained silent in that time. He and Nesha were growing less and less certain those bastards would send a green after them. He guessed Baldy must have done an even better job pressuring them than he'd expected, as they didn't seem to have the luxury of delegating one of their elites to hunt Mickey down just yet. "I think it's worth waiting a few more weeks. If they do send us a green, it'll help me massively." Not that he was looking forward to fighting the powerful mage. It was certainly going to be dangerous, but having another high-grade soul to toss into the mix might just make the difference between success and failure. Half an hour later, Percy finished carving the runes on the last 2 carcasses, deciding to finally call it a night. There was still some time before he had to go to bed, but he wanted to work on something else too. And he wasn't the only one rushing his preparations. "How are the new traps coming along?" he asked. Nesha had already incorporated the control rune within the traps, and she was currently busy scattering them all over the grizzly bog, preparing for the ambush. "Well, I've verified I can control them remotely, though they still break after closing and opening a few times. But that's not a problem, is it? We only need them to close once." Percy nodded, though he didn't say anything. If they could catch the green off guard, they might be able to sever a leg or two. But that was a big if. Each advancement greatly improved a mage's reflexes, sharpening their senses. Even if their opponent failed to notice the traps, they might still be able to escape before Nesha had the chance to close them. In fact, Percy had given her multiple slabs of stone engraved with concealment runes to place above her traps, to hide them from mana sense. It wasn't as good as incorporating the runes directly into the enchantment, but neither Percy nor Nesha were skilled enough to do that just yet. Unauthorized reproduction. This story has been taken without approval. Report sightings. I suppose we'll just have to pray it works. Bidding Mickey farewell, the two headed home. Suffice to say, the grisly bog was already full of traps and preserved bodies by now. They no longer even bothered to hide them. They couldn't. If one of the townsfolk decided to veer into the swamp one day, they'd instantly realize something was off. Luckily, nobody besides Percy or Nesha dared set foot there anymore. Reaching their house, they took turns washing up outside, before entering their new bedroom. Percy and Nesha had taken a break from their other projects back when his clone was still studying in the vault, expanding their humble hut a little. It was still rather small, but at least they no longer had to sleep in Percy's workshop, sparing them from breathing in the forge's fumes all night long. That said, Percy wasn't planning to go to bed just yet. Pulling all the soul mana from his sternum, he released it out of his pores, emptying his first core. Then, he switched his focus to his abdomen, drawing some pure mana from it, directing it to his sternum. Naturally, he was going to work on his new spell again. The vault's books were extremely helpful, but it still took a lot of effort to master a new spell, even a crude one. Percy's status had yet to register it, despite the significant amount of progress he'd made on it over the past few weeks. Let's see. I'm supposed to control the rate by which I feed the foreign mana to my soul core. Converting mana from other affinities to one's own could be likened to digesting a meal. In this analogy, pure mana was the easiest on the stomach, but that didn't mean Percy could dump everything in his first core all at once and expect that to work. If he pushed it too far, he could damage his core instead, giving himself mana poisoning. Should that happen, both his capacity and regeneration would drop massively for a few days, a situation best avoided. On the other hand, if he played it safe and moved too little pure mana into the core, he'd just needlessly slow the conversion down. Much like with a core's purification, this was all about finding the right balance, something that typically required a lot of trial and error. Luckily for Percy, he could skip a lot of that due to being the owner of both cores, making it several times easier for him to determine when his first core was saturated. In fact, he'd already realized a rudimentary version of the spell weeks ago. He was currently just working on improving it. Tonight, for sure. Ignoring the beads of sweat accumulating on his forehead, he concentrated on the delicate process, carefully fine-tuning the mana flowing from one core to the other. When the time of the experiment came, he'd have to do this with synchronization active. For now, he was happy taking it easy though, wanting to perfect the spell first, before adding to the difficulty. 5%. Activating Mana Sense, he watched the droplets of heavy, corporeal mana transform into the softer, ethereal variant, subtly taking advantage of his understanding of both affinities to guide them along another area where he had an advantage over other pure users. 10%. At some point, Percy realized his pure mana was about to run out, the flow between the two cores slowing down to a trickle. But he didn't let that distract him, as he redoubled his efforts to improve his efficiency, hoping to finally reach the first milestone. 15%. His second core finally dried out, the flow halting completely. Though there was still a sliver of pure mana left in Percy's body, swirling inside his first core. The organ gnawed at it greedily, causing this last strand to shrink at an alarming rate. Have I failed again? Yet, just as the final dregs of cyan evaporated, one final droplet of silver fell, splashing down with the rest, the status finally pitching in to announce Percy's accomplishment. Congratulations! You have mastered a new spell. Self-bestowal crude. Percy couldn't help but grin as he stared at the notification. This wasn't his first spell, nor the most impressive, but registering it filled him with relief. He knew he was on a timer to get everything ready before the enemy scion finally arrived in the town. There's still room for improvement though, he reminded himself, as he gauged the soul mana in his sternum. In the end, he'd managed to replenish about 20% of it. This could be considered good by Remir standards, but not by Percy's. He'd already cheated extensively to get here this quickly, by being both the bestower and recipient of the mana. Based on everything he'd learned at the vault, he was confident he should be able to reach 30% in due time. The only question was whether he'd get there soon enough. Did it finally register? Nesha asked, startling Percy. It was only now he realized she was still awake. She was playing with that black butterfly of hers again, making it fly above her palm. It had improved greatly over the past few months too, both its shape and its flight looking a lot more elegant than before. It didn't even leak that many motes in its passing anymore. Yes. He nodded. How about yours? Is it refined yet? From what she told him, her status had already registered the spell some time ago, though she hadn't stopped working on it. Percy was actually a little impressed by Nesha's growth, both as a mage and as a person. He'd certainly never expected the day would come when the lazy girl would stay up this late, practicing her magic alongside him. Why are you looking at me like that? I just don't want to get killed by a green mage because some red-born idiot decided to go on a war against an entire house by himself. She rolled her eyes, probably realizing what he was thinking. And no, still crude, though I can make a few of them at once. Percy chuckled at her quip, but he knew she wasn't wrong. An orange trying to stage an ambush against a green was probably unprecedented in the entire history of Remir. He was definitely playing with fire. One wrong move and he'd lose everything. But I won't let that happen. I'll make sure we win. House Tantalus is nothing more than a stepping stone for my ambition. Chapter 165, Ambush. In the end, 3 more months passed in relative quiet. Naturally, Percy hadn't stopped sending out clones in that time, hoping one of them would stumble upon something interesting. Sadly, that hadn't happened. He hadn't bothered to return to the vault either, as none of his recent hosts seemed suited for the combat challenges. Of course, he could have tried learning some more runes. He definitely had enough credits. That said, he didn't have time to practice them, busy as he was. Things on Remir hadn't changed much either. Everyone had continued working on their projects, Percy and Nesha both making great strides with their new spells. Percy's self-bestowal had improved noticeably by now, though his status had yet to acknowledge that. As for Mickey, he had continued his relentless hunt for yellow beasts, eating their cores before delivering their bodies to Percy, dumping them in the preservation runes. By now, they'd wasted dozens upon dozens of souls, fighting to maintain their stash. In fact, Percy was afraid they were close to driving the yellow beasts to extinction. At least, Mickey no longer managed to find one every day. Watching the souls crumble, Percy was beginning to reconsider his plan. They'd have to go through with the experiment in the next couple of weeks, regardless of whether an enemy arrived in that time. Delaying any longer would hurt more than it helped. Luckily for him, the noble finally reached Bogside Town just days later. What do you think? Nesha bit her lip. Percy could tell she was nervous, and he didn't blame her for it either. Talking and planning about ambushing a green and actually going through with it were 2 entirely different things. The 2 observed the man from a distance. He was standing just outside the tavern, chatting with Fagin, presumably discussing the bog situation with the old man. He wore the same standard attire as all the other nobles of House Tantalus, his elegant silken robes adorned with his family's insignia, a man's face sporting a set of strangely elongated canines. Though his was green, under different circumstances, Percy and Nesha might have looked suspicious spying on him. But they weren't alone. Half the town was doing the same, ogling the powerful noble in curiosity. After all, it wasn't every day a green visited them. Not the strongest they've got. Not the weakest either. Percy whispered back. The man didn't have the bloodline. His skin was a healthy shade of pink. He didn't look that young either, meaning he was probably an older Orangeborn. This wasn't a good thing as it meant he was more experienced. Other distinguishing features included a bald head and a scruffy ginger beard. According to our information, he's either Gryan or his cousin, Broos. Percy elaborated. He sure hoped it was the former, as Gryan had a pure affinity. If it was Broos, they'd have a tougher time. But it was a coin toss at this point. Are you sure you still want to go through with this? Nesha asked, clenching her fists. It's not too late to call it off. Just tell Mickey to hide until he's gone. But Percy shook his head. Forget it. I haven't spent the last 4 months carving preservation runes day in and day out only to give up when the guy finally shows up. Besides, there's no escaping this now. How so? Nesha furrowed her brow. Need I remind you that the swamp is full of traps and other traces of activity? No way he misses all that. Percy explained, before continuing. If he goes in, he'll know there are humans working with Mickey. After that, he'll interrogate the townsfolk until they all figure out it's us. What if we run away now? We can circle around the province and escape towards your family's mansion. There's no guarantee he won't catch up. I don't know about you, but if I'm going to face him, I'd much rather do so in the swamp, taking advantage of all our arrangements. Nesha swallowed hard, the finality of their situation hitting her. There was only one way out of this, and it was over that man's corpse. So how do we handle it then? Have Mickey keep him busy until nightfall? No way. I'm not leaving Mickey alone with him. Let's head to the swamp now, before he's done talking to Fagin. What if somebody comes looking for us later? It'll look suspicious if we disappear right before this guy goes missing, Nesha said. But Percy only smiled bitterly in return. That's tomorrow's problem. For now, let's focus on surviving. The sunlight barely pierced through the dense canopies, softly illuminating the muddy waters of the grisly bog. Percy and Nesha had split up, each hiding behind a different tree. Green spells were more than powerful enough to kill them both in one fell swoop, so they figured it was best to not stay clustered together. The story has been taken without consent. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. They'd also wrapped more homemade bandages around their torsos to hide their grades and, in Percy's case, his mana channels once he used synchronization. Not that it would make much of a difference, but he'd gladly take any edge he could get. As for where they got them from, naturally, he'd crafted them himself, engraving the preservation runes on a few long strips of linen. They weren't as good as the one Baldy had given him, nor the ones Nesha had purchased for Mickey back in the Alchemist's Guild. But it couldn't be helped. Percy didn't have access to the enchanted silk those were made of. Instead, he'd embroidered their interior with reinforced cyan constructs, meaning they wouldn't last very long, nor would the cover they provided be as ironclad. Oh well, they'll have to do. The rhythmic squelch of boots trudging through the muddy waters broke him out of his thoughts. The sounds were interspaced with the occasional crunch of a twig breaking, betraying their opponent's arrival. Percy's heart pounded heavily in his chest, thrumming with both excitement and fear in equal measure. And he knew this feeling, having experienced it a few times before. It was the same he'd felt back when he ambushed Rick and his goons, or when he fought against the Starry Knight. This was a fight he couldn't guess the outcome of. Biting his tongue, he forced himself to calm down, breathing as deeply and as quietly as he could manage, directing the ambient mana to his two cores. At the same time, he nodded at Nesha, who was hiding some distance away. Next, he coordinated with Mickey too. Don't approach him. Just fly in the vicinity and be ready to intervene if one of us needs backup. Percy knew Mickey was strong, but he couldn't risk his friend. The trio patiently waited for their opponent to draw nearer, mentally preparing for the difficult fight ahead. And soon it was upon them. He's about to step on a trap, Percy grinned. This wasn't some big coincidence either. He and Nesha had practically filled the place up with them. It was never a question of if it would happen, only when. That said, their window to act would be brief, and he refused to waste it. Taking another deep breath, he forced his boosting art to take effect, clenching the invisible scythe tightly in his grasp. The cyan and silver motes leaked out of his pores, soon blending into a teal halo, enveloping his reddening skin as he accumulated fused mana. I sure hope the concealment rune works, he thought, rushing to complete his preparations in time. Percy had carved one on the tree's trunk too, to hide the sudden spike of mana until the last second. Shifting his weight on his back foot, he extended his right hand, the one holding the weapon backwards, tensing his muscles. Then he sprung forth using all the strength he could muster, throwing the Soul Harvester through the trunk, its sinister edge spinning soundlessly towards the enemy mage. The scythe covered half the distance in an instant. Percy's heart skipped a beat, thinking it was going to land. But it wasn't meant to be. The experienced noble noticed something was off at the last second, instinctively stepping out of the crescent blade's path. Unfortunately for him, however, his foot landed right on top of a pitfall. Not wasting a moment, the girl triggered the pocket rune, causing him to fall through the collapsing ground. Sadly, he barely sank a few inches before hardening a sheet of dirt underneath his feet, arresting his momentum. Realizing this was the best they were going to get, Nesha toggled the enchantment again, managing to slice the man's left foot off as he leapt out of the trap. The Earth Mage let out a pained groan as a fountain of blood poured out of the stump. But he didn't let the injury distract him, immediately rolling on the muddy ground, narrowly evading the barrage of teal projectiles raining down at him. Percy clicked his tongue in annoyance, lamenting the fact that the throwing stars weren't engraved with concealment runes like his scythe. That wasn't the end of their offensive, however, as a handful of black butterflies rapidly zigged and zagged around the trees, homing onto the noble from several directions. At the same time, Nesha activated all the other pitfalls around him, trying to destabilize the ground. Yet the man wasn't having it. Pulling a ridiculous amount of earth mana from his sternum, he sent a violent shockwave underneath him, crushing all the traps into dust. At the same time, 5 stone pillars rose from the ground, accurately slamming into the butterflies, one after the other. The earth constructs shattered upon impact, but so did Nesha's spells. While space mana was powerful and destructive, it could still be overpowered with enough brute force. Luckily, Percy had one last trick up his sleeve. Reaching out to his scythe, which was currently lodged in the ground a few meters behind the Earth Mage, he pulled it towards him, while robbing it of its substance. Spinning through the air at a frightening speed, the now incorporeal construct was on course to chop the oblivious noble right in half. The man was still trying to get back to his foot when the weapon reached him. He did notice it again, but, between the scythe's close proximity and the agonizing pain of his injury, he reacted a second too late this time. Granted, he barely managed to avoid a lethal wound, but he failed to dodge the construct entirely. Willing the scythe to materialize, Percy watched a flash of teal illuminate the gloomy bog, slicing through the man's arm. The severed limb splashed into the mud a moment later, as another fountain of blood gushed out of the wound. Falling to his knees, the color drained from the green's face, the man looking like he was about to pass out. Though he didn't let that happen. Experienced as he was, he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep looking at his opponents, keenly aware that his life would be forfeit should he faint here. Percy smirked, thinking they had this in the bag, when he noticed something strange through mana sense. "Shit! Dodge!" he warned his companion as he caught the man's sinister intention at the last second. Leaping to one side, he barely avoided getting impaled by a stalagmite, before shifting his attention to Nesha. The girl hadn't reacted as quickly as him, the construct rending a chunk of flesh off her thigh. It wasn't lethal, but she wouldn't be able to stay in the fight. Turning back to the Earth Mage, he saw the pain in his expression was strangely muted, a subtle grin now replacing it. The bastard was just baiting them before. But that was only the beginning, as the guy manifested 2 massive javelins, each thicker than Percy's arm. Next, he launched one towards him and one towards Nesha, evidently intent on finishing her with this move. Mickey! A comet of green and amber dove towards the javelin at a ridiculous speed, crushing it in his talons. Following Percy's earlier instructions, he snatched Nesha up, flying away before the Earth Mage had the chance to follow up. Though a few words seeped through their bond a moment later, tinged with worry. "What about you? What else?" Percy shrugged. "I'll finish the job." Chapter 166. Slugfest. Fighting against a green by himself was arguably reckless, but the man was already 2 limbs down. If Percy couldn't even beat him in this state, then it would just mean their plan had been doomed from the start. "Just who are you people? Are you members of House Avalon?" Percy wasn't that surprised by the accurate guess, but he wasn't that interested in chatting either. Dashing forward, he launched another round of throwing stars, not even bothering to turn them invisible this time. The guy would just spot them through mana sense. The Earth Mage hopped out of the way using his one good leg. His movements looked a little silly, but he didn't get hit even once, evading all the constructs without fail. Not just that, but Percy didn't miss the ripples of earth mana spreading through the ground every time the man's foot landed in the mud. "Nice try." Percy leapt out of the way whenever his opponent's soul flared, dodging the rising stalagmites. Still, this wasn't going to work. Even with synchronization active and 2 cores at his disposal, Percy couldn't possibly match a green's regeneration. At this rate, he would run out of mana first. Calling the scythe back, he threw it at his opponent, following it by another barrage of teal daggers. The man dodged everything again, but he was forced to use some mana at the end, propelling himself out of a dagger's path. Good. This can work. Percy grinned, pulling the Soul Harvester towards him once more, pressing on his advantage. The scythe's attacks didn't cost him any mana, so he could keep spamming them to drain his opponent. Of course, he was certain the man could easily shatter the weapon to pieces if he managed to grab a hold of it. Sadly for him, however, this wasn't an option. Not as long as Percy kept it in its incorporeal state. That said, the Earth Mage didn't allow himself to remain passive either. Intensifying his own efforts to pin Percy down, he unleashed a relentless onslaught of powerful spells. He shot lots of compact stone arrows at ridiculous speeds, pairing them with insidious stalagmites that stabbed from various angles. Percy had to keep his soul vision glued to his opponent's soul, and his mana sense fixed on the ground beneath his feet, barely giving himself the briefest of margins to dodge the deadly attacks. Like that, the 2 men danced on the battlefield, the splashing waters of the swamp breaking the somber silence of the grisly bog. On one side, Broos had the overwhelming advantage afforded to him by his higher grade and his many decades of experience, as well as the confidence that came with it. Unfortunately for him, he was also missing 2 limbs, leaking a scary amount of blood with every passing second. On the other side, Percy had his own tools to rely on, desperately trying to bridge the monumental gap to his monstrous opponent. His boosting art and twin cores worked together to elevate his physique beyond a yellow's, but even that wasn't enough by itself. He had to supplement his lacking reflexes with the foresight afforded to him by soul vision, and to bolster his subpar agility with the grace and precision of his 2 fighting styles. As for the difference in mana regeneration, his only choice was to whittle Bruce's mana pool down, 1 spell at a time, by exploiting the scythe he had painstakingly created. In other words, Percy had to use everything at his disposal, and then some, hoping it would be enough. But it was, or seemed to be at least. At some point, Percy noticed his opponent's attack had come a second too late. He didn't think much of it at first, but it happened again a minute later, and then a third time even sooner than that. Once or twice could be written off as a mistake, but this was starting to look like a pattern. Either he's trying to bait me again, or the blood loss is finally getting to him. Both were possible. The guy had already proven he was as cunning as a fox. But he was human too, and he'd already lost a ton of blood by now. Not willing to miss what might be a huge opportunity, Percy prepared his mantle again, launching another barrage of throwing stars, while simultaneously pulling the scythe towards him. Unable to dodge both attacks, Broos chose to evade the far deadlier harvester, allowing some of the throwing stars to hit him. He winced as 3 of them sank a couple inches into his soul, his knee visibly shaking from the pain. But he didn't let himself collapse just yet. Still, Percy knew it was only a matter of time. Not a bluff then. He really is at the end of the rope. Capitalizing on this, Percy repeated the same tactic, forcing his opponent to eat another handful of small attacks, gnawing away at his endurance 1 shallow wound at a time. This tale has been unlawfully lifted from Royal Road. Report any instances of this story if found elsewhere. But the experienced Green wasn't going to give up this easily, it seemed. The third time Percy tried this, Broos dodged the scythe again, though he didn't even bother to avoid the throwing stars, letting them hit him all at once. The damage caused his soul to shudder, but he ignored it. He glared hatefully at Percy, his eyes bloodshot, a savage grin plastered all over his face. At the same time, a large amount of mana gushed out of his sternum. This was everything the man had left, before unleashing several spells at Percy all at once. 3 stalagmites shot at him from various angles, forcing him to tiptoe around 2 of them, twisting his torso at an unnatural angle to narrowly escape the third one. But that was just the beginning, as 4 stone arrows arrived next, right when Percy was in no position to dodge them properly. He did manage to avoid 2 of them, but the third one pierced a hole in his shoulder, all but disabling his left arm entirely. As for the last one, it was heading straight towards Percy's heart. He couldn't evade it. Gritting his teeth, Percy turned the Soul Harvester corporeal, rotating its shaft to block the arrow. It worked, sort of, as the 2 constructs collided against one another, shattering in a rain of shrapnel. Percy had escaped certain death, but he didn't come out of this unscathed either. Coughing a mouthful of blood, he fell to his knees, half a dozen shards of his own spell lodged into his torso. One had even grazed his cheek, leaving a shallow cut right below his eye. Had it flown a couple inches to the left, Percy might have died already. Damn. This was his goal all along. He realized grimly, looking up at the Earth Mage. He was grinning at him. The man had probably realized he couldn't win unless he robbed Percy of his weapon first. After all, the scythe was quite the cheat. It packed more of a punch than a yellow spell, and Percy could keep spamming it at no cost. And the only way to rob Percy of his weapon had been to force him to block with it. It doesn't matter. His condition is just as shitty as mine. No, it's even worse. He's out of mana. Broos was breathing heavily, his core empty. Apparently, this last move had cost him the last of his reserves. I can't let him recover. Knowing this was his chance, Percy smashed the 3 stalagmites trapping him, freeing his body before rising to his feet. Even the slightest movement hurt, but he had to kill his opponent before he began casting spells again. Ignoring his injuries, he dashed towards him as quickly as he could manage, while drawing the Soul Harvester towards him. More than half of the shaft was broken, but the piece holding the blade could still be used in a fight. As soon as he reached Broos, he swung the broken weapon down at him, trying to chop the man's soul to pieces. But the latter hopped out of the way without much difficulty. He didn't seem to struggle detecting the weapon either, as its enchantment had come undone in many places, a series of cracks ruining the few remaining concealment runes. Percy wasn't one to be deterred so easily, however. Pivoting around the Earth Mage, he slashed at him horizontally, aiming right below his ribs. Broos leapt backwards to avoid the attack, before diving forward again, trying to land a hook with his remaining fist. Percy hurriedly ducked, feeling a rush of air brush over his hair. He was keenly aware he'd lose his head should the green's punch connect. Then, I guess I just won't give you the chance. Spitting a mouthful of blood at his enemy's face, Percy rushed him again, stabbing at his torso. The man twisted his body to avoid it, having probably seen through the clumsy sneak attack via mana sense. Next, he punched at Percy's stomach. Percy had to move the scythe's blade in the way to absorb some of the impact. The teal construct shattered into more shards as Percy was sent back, his feet carving 2 wide trails through the mud. Not giving up, he summoned the shards to his hand, one of them stabbing his palm by accident. But he ignored the pain, tossing them at Broos, hoping he'd have a tougher time avoiding them like this. The latter hopped away from the first one, ducked beneath the second, only allowing the third to graze his arm, before sending 2 more stalagmites stabbing at Percy, exhausting his reserves again. Percy pushed against the first stalagmite, using it as a crutch to dodge the second, before drawing the shards to him once more, trying to hit his opponent from behind. At the same time, he also emptied his own cores, throwing a few teal daggers too. Finally, the Earth Mage failed miserably, getting hit by most of the projectiles. 2 of the shards stabbed into his back, a handful of the knives digging into his soul. But none of the constructs had enough force behind them to rip a green soul apart. Left with no other choice, Percy dashed forward, slamming into his opponent with as much strength as he could muster, knocking him into the mud. Broos tried to fight back, but Percy didn't let him, punching with his one good hand again and again, trying to pummel the enemy's skull into a pulp. Eventually, the man managed to land a hit of his own on Percy's stomach, causing him to cough another mouthful of blood. Uncaring about the sweet taste of iron in his mouth, and unbothered by the sticky liquid dirtying his chin, Percy resumed his assault, hoping his opponent would give out before he did. The two continued their brutal slugfest, Percy's flesh bruising and his bones cracking every time his opponent connected. Luckily for him, Broos had already lost most of his strength. His attacks barely a shadow of what they should have been. This was the only reason Percy had even lasted this long. Neither of them bothered to replenish their mana anymore. It was impossible as both combatants were constantly out of breath. At this point, Percy was just happy synchronization was still active. The few dregs of mana swirling around his channels were the only things keeping him alive. Whoever ended up winning, this fight was destined to end by one's fist. Everything blurred in Percy's vision, as he continued to unleash everything he had at his opponent. In the end, he didn't even register when the man breathed his last. The only thing that gave Percy pause was when he saw Bruce's soul beginning to crumble. Exhaling in relief, he wanted nothing more than to plop back and rest. But he couldn't do that just yet. He didn't worry about Nesha as much. Mickey should have taken her to where they'd stashed some of their spare healing potions. But there was one thing he still had to do. The operation. I need to get Mickey to eat his soul, or everything will have been for nothing. Chapter 167. Operation. Percy fought against the pain and exhaustion to keep his eyes open, waiting for the others to return. Doing so proved almost as difficult as the battle itself. Eventually, he heard the rhythmic flap of Mickey's wings. Tilting his head up, he saw the crow approach rapidly, dropping Nesha in a murky pond a few meters away, before landing next to him. "Are you okay? What happened here?" the girl asked, scanning the ravaged battlefield. It was full of craters and broken pieces of stone jutting out of the swamp waters, along with the occasional shard of teal faintly shimmering beneath the surface. Percy remained silent, merely pointing at Bruce's body, lying motionless by his side. That was explanation enough. Nodding in understanding, Nesha then limped over. The bleeding in her leg had stopped, but her injury wasn't fully healed. Percy didn't miss the two vials clenched tightly in her hand, a verdant liquid swirling inside. They should have been more than enough to complete her recovery. Evidently, she'd chosen to hold on to them instead. For me, Percy almost teared up. Sure, he was the one who'd bought the potions in the first place, but it was the thought that counted. That said, he shoved the pointless thoughts to the back of his mind for now. They had more urgent things to worry about. Grab the corpse and take it to the others. Then eat them all, starting from the strongest one. He told Mickey. And hurry up. We'll only get one shot at this. The crow didn't hesitate. Scooping Bruce's body, he took off promptly. But Nesha didn't seem as convinced this was a good idea. "Are you sure this is the time to be experimenting with your soul? How about resting first?" she asked, though she still handed him the potions. "The longer we delay, the less soul mana we'll be able to extract from the carcasses." Percy shook his head. "I don't know about you, but I've gone through too much shit to mess it up now." Then he pulled the last shard out of his chest, wincing in the process. Finally, he accepted the vials, uncorking them both before gulping them down, one after the other. At first, blood gushed out of his wounds, but it slowed down to a trickle as soon as the potions took effect. About a minute later, the soreness in his muscles faded a little too, his exhaustion partially muted. He still wasn't in the best condition, but he should at least be functional. He tossed the empty vials one last glance before placing them in his pocket. Sadly, these had been the last of their potions. They'd have to be a lot more careful moving forward, as they no longer had the means to heal if they got injured. "I should have read up on potions while I was still in the guild." He smiled bitterly. Of course, it wasn't like he'd had much spare time back then. His schedule had been packed with more important things. Besides, the potions would only grow less effective with each promotion. Sighing, he walked over to a boulder sticking out of the water's surface, sitting on it cross-legged. Taking a deep breath, he directed the ambient mana to his cores, activating his boosting art. "No time to waste. I need to refill my reserves by the time Mickey starts sending me mana. Nesha, can you please watch over me for a couple of hours?" he asked his companion. The last thing he needed was to be interrupted by a wild beast during the delicate procedure. Nesha didn't say anything, but he saw her nod by the corner of his eye. She might not be the most skilled combatant, but she shouldn't have much trouble keeping a yellow beast at bay. Not that there were many of those left in the swamp. Next, Percy thought back to the scattered memories of his unfortunate clone, recalling how he was meant to proceed. Gathering some soul mana to his index finger, he inflicted a series of shallow incisions along his limbs and torso. It might have not been necessary, as his soul was plenty banged up already, but he didn't want to stray from his instructions. A case of theft. This story is not rightfully on Amazon. If you spot it, report the violation. It's best to do it properly. Maybe those cuts are placed there for a reason. Percy finished his preparations just in time, as a river of soul mana gushed through the cord, filling his frame up in an instant. Obviously, this mana was from Broos, its quantity and quality reminding him of the Starry Nights. Unwilling to waste a single drop, Percy directed it to his wounds, supplementing it with mana from his channels. Nesha let out a surprised yelp, probably not having expected him to release such a colossal amount of soul mana from his body. But he wasn't done just yet. As soon as his first core reached an equilibrium, absorbing ambient mana from his lungs as quickly as it came, Percy moved some pure mana from his abdomen to his sternum. Next, he carefully poured as much into his first core as it could safely handle. The action made him feel bloated, the organ struggling to process the two streams of mana at once. Yet, Percy wasn't deterred. Capitalizing on the technique he'd spent the last couple of months mastering, he began the arduous process of converting one affinity to the other, adding a third source of soul mana to the mix. This is all so complicated, Percy groaned, his head throbbing in pain. There were way too many disparate tasks straining his already tired mind, and he had to juggle them all perfectly, as even the tiniest mistake could throw the whole operation in disarray. He had to keep enough mana in his channels to prevent synchronization from fizzling out prematurely, and he also had to maintain self-bestowal at a precise margin. And finally, there was one last thing he needed to worry about. As the 3 rivers of soul mana rushed out of his wounds, he brought all his memories of death and suffering to the forefront of his mind, trying to lace the mana with the right scent, to make it more enticing for his target. Come on, take a bite, will you? I went through so much trouble to prepare the perfect meal for you. Seconds became minutes, as Percy fought against his own body to keep everything in an equilibrium, the promise of power pushing him forward. Strictly speaking, he still didn't know what exact benefit the mysterious creature might give him once he absorbed it, but his clone had made one thing clear. It was worth it. However, the first complication emerged sooner than Percy would have liked. No, his target had yet to approach. And no, he hadn't made a mistake either. Instead, it was Mickey who suddenly stopped feeding him mana. What happened? Don't tell me Bruce's soul has run out already? Not that he was keeping track of time, but he felt it hadn't been nearly long enough. Had he simply been too absorbed in the operation to register the passage of time? Or had the man's soul deteriorated too much? Either way, Mickey didn't say anything. Instead, he responded by moving on to the yellow corpses, a new trickle of mana soon flowing through the cord. Of course, it paled in comparison with the last one, but it couldn't be helped. It is what it is, I suppose, Percy sighed, returning to the task at hand. This would certainly make things more difficult, but it didn't necessarily mean they'd failed. That was something they'd only determine at the end, after they'd fully exhausted every last drop of mana. Right now, his best bet was to keep going for as long as he could. Gritting his teeth, he pushed synchronization even further, delving into a dangerous territory. His channels burned, as his cores felt like they were about to burst, but the flow of soul mana strengthened ever so slightly. That said, this wasn't enough to make up for the loss. Next, he switched his attention to the self-bestowal spell. It worked tirelessly to transform the mana from one affinity to the other. But it wasn't good enough. Not fast enough. Pushing the technique along, one small nudge at a time, Percy risked giving himself mana poisoning to eke a few more drops of soul mana out of the spell. At the same time, he delved even deeper into the conversion process, focusing on the very natures of the involved affinities. Pure and soul mana were different in many ways but similar in others. Both appeared soft and weak at first, with pure mana making for flimsy constructs that crumbled easily, and soul mana not even perceptible to the naked eye, nor particularly effective in a fight when used blindly. In fact, Percy had personally suffered from this perceived weakness of each of his cores at different times. But that's just an illusion, isn't it? Neither of these mana types was truly as they seemed. When used correctly, soul mana was one of the deadliest. By now, he had already honed it into the sharpest, most potent weapon in his arsenal. And that was without mentioning its utility in mending and preserving souls, or the unprecedented interaction with his clone bloodline that had given him so much. And the same was true for pure mana. While it was widely considered the weakest affinity, that only held true for those too ignorant of its many uses. Whether it was the revolutionary elixirs that had turned Remir upside down, or the reinforced constructs that elevated his cyan mana into a true pillar of his arsenal, pure mana held its fair share of secrets once one dug deep enough. Both of them are brimming with untapped potential. At that moment, something clicked in Percy's mind, as his understanding and appreciation of the two affinities rose to a new level. Responding to his thoughts, the cyan mana in his sternum began to shift even more rapidly, seemingly eager to transform. His soul core, too, started devouring the substance with even greater zeal, as Percy's status finally pitched in. Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Self-bestowal, crude-soul conversion, refined. Chapter 168 Outcome. Seeing the notification, Percy couldn't help but crack a smile. This wasn't what he'd set out to accomplish, but it now meant that even if the operation ended up failing, it wouldn't have all been for nothing. That said, he wasn't going to give up so easily either. Let's make it 2 for 2. Leaning onto his newly upgraded spell, he intensified his efforts in releasing the mana out of his body. Opening his eyes, he couldn't help but draw a sharp breath as he gazed at the scene before him, almost messing up his boosting art's rhythm. Everywhere he looked, he was surrounded by a thick, silver mist. He had no idea how far it reached, but it was definitely beyond the edge of his sight. And, judging by Nesha's awestruck expression, she could probably see the substance too, even without soul vision. It was dense enough to be visible to the naked eye, but Percy didn't allow himself to get distracted. Diving back into the task at hand, he used both of his refined spells, continuously pouring more mana out of his body, pushing it outwards into the cosmos. Or, well, at least that's what he hoped he was doing. Either way, he kept at it for a long time, only stopping when, at some point, he noticed the mana had stopped seeping through the cord. Creasing his brow, he was about to ask Mickey what happened, but the crow beat him to it. "I'm sorry, Percy. That was the last body," Mickey said, sounding a little disappointed. Truth be told, Percy wasn't feeling much better. By now, he'd had to face the fact that this was unlikely to work. He was already well into the tail end of the operation, his current output a mere shadow of what he'd started with. Despite their excessive preparations and the many risks they'd undertaken, it appeared they had still failed to lure the mysterious creature to Remir. How much mana do I even need? Or is that even the problem? Is it possible the technique just doesn't work for humans? Lots of questions were floating around Percy's mind, though he hadn't halted his efforts quite yet. He knew his odds of succeeding dwindled with every passing minute, but he figured he should see this to the very end, just to be thorough. He'd come this far after all. Synchronization was the first of his spells to give out, which happened a few hours later. Perhaps it might have lasted a while longer had he attempted the experiment in a better state, but he'd chosen to do this right after barely surviving a brutal fight. Soul conversion didn't put as much of a strain on his body, but there wasn't much point keeping it active by itself. Without the boosting art, he didn't even have any pure mana to convert. With a heavy heart, Percy finally let go of the spell, realizing it just wasn't meant to be. He was about to draw upon whatever dregs of mana were still coursing around his channels, to patch the tears in his soul, when he caught something glinting by the corner of his eye. Raising an eyebrow, he examined it more closely. The object glowed in a silver color, somehow bright enough to even pierce through the dense fog in his surroundings. And it grew brighter still by the second, apparently heading straight towards him. If this was any other day, his first assumption would have been that his clone was on the way back to Remir, but he hadn't sent one. Don't tell me? His heart skipped a beat, though his next thought caused the color to drain from his face. Shit, I'm out of mana. So focused had he been on actually luring the creature over, that he forgot he was supposed to keep part of his reserves on the side so that he could actually handle it if he succeeded. Panicking, he began to breathe rapidly again, forcing some of the mana he'd just released back into his core. Unable to gauge how much time he had left, he hoped he'd be able to replenish enough mana to protect himself. The good news was that it didn't take much effort to gather it, nor did it need to be converted. The silver mist in his surroundings was already filled to the brim with soul mana. His own soul mana. Percy was practically swimming in it, as it flowed back into his core with a single thought, filling it up rapidly. That said, his channels protested loudly over his efforts, burning intensely wherever the mana flowed. This content has been misappropriated from Royal Road. Report any instances of this story if found elsewhere. Pipe down already. We'll get some rest as soon as this is over. He didn't even get to complete that thought when something slammed into him like a meteor. The shockwave shook his very soul, reminding him of when his clones returned. Though, instead of latching into its rightful place inside a crater in his stomach, this object tried to forcefully squeeze through the shallow cuts, worming its way into Percy's channels. What's more, it lashed out violently against its surroundings, trying to tear Percy's soul apart from within. What the hell is this? The pain was agonizing, but he'd always known this was some kind of living creature he was inviting into his body, drawing some of his recently replenished mana. He surrounded the intruder from every direction, blocking its paths. The creature wasn't having it, however, biting against the interior of Percy's channels, trying to dig itself out of the blockade. Gritting his teeth, Percy clamped down on it forcefully, trying to trap it in place. It resisted, thrashing against the mana, trying to extricate itself from its shackles. It appeared to be on the losing side, but Percy still hesitated to bring this thing into his core. What if it caused him some serious injury? However, he shook his head a moment later, realizing he was being silly. A mana core was even sturdier than one's channels. He'd also have a lot more mana there, not to mention much greater control over it. If the creature failed to fight its way out of the channel, it wouldn't stand a chance inside the core. Making up his mind, he finally pushed the creature along the narrow tube, slowly forcing it into his sternum. Once it fell inside, he unleashed all the mana he could muster against it, squeezing it into a tiny ball. Not as tough now, are you? He couldn't help but exhale in relief. The hardest part was already behind him. The only thing left was to absorb the creature and reap his reward, whatever that was. Percy? What happened to you? Did it work? Nesha fired a barrage of questions, her voice tinged with concern. Opening his eyes, Percy noticed she was giving him a weird look. She must have watched him as he fought to contain the mysterious creature, though she'd ultimately chosen not to say anything, not wanting to disturb him during the critical moment. Mickey was there too, having returned at some point. It's fine. I'm fine. I've got everything under control. He hurriedly explained, his friend's expressions easing. Mickey, can you help me figure out what this thing is? Strictly speaking, Percy knew how he was meant to proceed, but he'd rather figure out what exactly he was dealing with before absorbing it into his soul. Especially since the procedure was supposed to be irreversible as far as he could tell. Heeding his request, the crow inched closer, peering into Percy's sternum with its innate soul vision, as Percy did the same. It was hard for them to discern the creature's shape, compressed as it was. Percy cautiously loosened his hold over it, letting it stretch a little. Though he didn't see much, only catching a glimpse of what he thought was a bug's leg. Got anything? He asked his familiar. Not sure. I think it looks like a spider. Nodding, Percy continued observing the creature for a couple minutes, trying to piece together its appearance from the momentary twists and turns in its shape. In the end, he somewhat agreed with Mickey's assessment. The creature did resemble a spider, at least to the extent that it resembled any animal he was familiar with, though it seemed to have a few too many legs. While he failed to count all of them, he was pretty confident it had over a dozen. Moreover, the twig-like limbs appeared to bend in every which direction. Whatever the creature used them for, it wasn't to walk on solid ground. Oh well, let's face it, could have looked like anything and I'd still absorb it. He shrugged. Swirling the mana inside his core, he peeled layer after layer of the creature's body, causing it to squirm in pain. Honestly, this part made Percy feel a little bad, even triggering some traumatic memory for a second there. But he didn't stop. He couldn't let a spider's feelings stand between him and his goals. Percy watched the severed chunks of the creature's body dissolve in his core, before sending some of the mana through his channels, spreading the substance around his soul. And, perhaps not unexpectedly, this action caused an immediate reaction. Wherever the mana traveled, Percy felt his body itch. It was as if somebody had emptied a bucket of ants inside him, the tiny pests crawling all over his organs. Except, this feeling didn't affect his flesh, but his soul. And just like with soul pain, this unpleasant sensation was 100 times more intense than the physical equivalent. If he wasn't sitting already, he was certain his knees would have buckled, as he desperately tried scratching the uncomfortable feeling out of his skin. Sadly for him, this wasn't something he could fix with his fingers. Still, he maintained enough awareness to keep an eye inside his sternum, unwilling to let the creature loose in his core. The latter kept its resistance up, struggling to free itself to no avail, its body dissolving rapidly amidst the rotating vortex of mana. This went on for a couple minutes, though to Percy they felt closer to hours. Luckily for him, the itching vanished without a trace as soon as the creature did. Whatever this operation had done to his soul, it was over. At this point, Percy wanted nothing more than to go to sleep, the past few days having been downright hellish. Yet, it would be remiss of him if he allowed himself to pass out before confirming one last thing. Spectral Trait. Chapter 169, Truth. A stray ray of sunlight licked Percy's eyelid, causing him to wrinkle his nose in irritation. He didn't wake up until a couple minutes later, however. The first thing he noticed was the stench of rotting wood and spoilt eggs. Not the most pleasant scent to come to, though it didn't take him long to recognize where he was, having spent months training in this very place. Why was I asleep in the middle of the swamp? A rush of memories soon followed, reminding him of yesterday's events. Or well, at least he hoped they were yesterday's. Shifting a little, he realized he was sitting against a tree's trunk. Apparently, his companions had been kind enough to not leave him rolling in the mud. Nesha was sleeping in a similar position a few paces away. Tracing Mickey's location through the cord, he soon found him perched up on a branch nearby, scanning their surroundings. Update. You finished doing the thing. Then you went to sleep. We took turns watching over you. It's been longer than a day. Percy nodded. There were plenty of things he had to take care of, but one of them took precedence over everything else. Not missing a beat, he pulled up his status again, this time taking the chance to examine it more closely. Percival Avalon. Mana Cores. Mana Core 1, Orange Soul. Mana Core 2, Orange Pure. Bloodline. Clone, create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity. Spectral Trait. Spells. A secret art. Familiar, crude. A glove, crude. A mend, crude. A soul conversion, refined. A soul harvester, refined. Reinforcement, refined. A synchronization, refined. Mantle of deceit, refined. Decrees. Phoebe's decree grants access to your status. Grants a bloodline. Morai's decree grants a second mana core. Metatron's decree. Open a one-way portal to the Vault of Magic at will. As usual, the section with his spells was a complete mess. The status seemed to group them based on their tier, but didn't bother sorting them beyond that. At least, they weren't in chronological order, and Percy couldn't spot any other pattern either. Not just that, but he could swear their order sometimes changed randomly for no apparent reason. The more I learn about it, the more shortcomings Phoebe's decree seems to have. Percy didn't want to be too ungrateful towards the Titaness. Her handiwork had done wonders for his sanity over the years. That said, he had to admit the status had plenty of room for improvement. In any case, he shook the pointless thoughts out of his head, his eyes moving to the most recent addition. Not that the question marks were particularly informative, but at least it meant the operation had been a success. I suppose whatever the trait does, I'll notice sooner or later. Hopefully, its name will update when the time comes to help me figure it out. Truth be told, Percy would much rather just receive his reward directly than have to solve another riddle. He'd earned it, having worked for months on this project, but it couldn't be helped. He very much doubted even the temple's evaluations could shed light on something this exotic. "You're awake," Nesha exclaimed, startling him. "I've been up for hours." Percy rolled his eyes, trying his best to maintain his composure. "I just didn't want to disturb your beauty sleep." "Nice try," she smirked. "Truth-seeker bloodline, remember? Unlawfully taken from Royal Road. This story should be reported if seen on Amazon." Shrugging, Percy didn't dwell on his poorly executed prank much. He pulled against the tree's trunk to yank himself to his feet. The movement hurt his body beyond sore. His mind wasn't doing much better, his brain feeling like mush. Even his channels burned quite intensely, despite having sat idle for so many hours. The thought of missing several doses of Aurora Dew stung the most, however. "And I'll have to skip a few more," he grimaced. "Best not to push my cores too far." Not that losing a week off his next promotion was the end of the world. Certainly not when it was over a decade away. But he'd rather not get into the habit of thinking like that. Growing up, he'd heard plenty of stories of lazy nobles who'd needlessly delayed their advancements by skipping cleansing sessions willy-nilly. Hell, if he wasn't mistaken, Uncle Gareth had wasted quite a few years like that, reaching green half a decade later than he was meant to. "I think you should be more worried about the mess we're in," Nesha said, guessing what he was thinking about. "It's not that bad. No matter what we do, House Tantalus isn't going to send a blue after us," he replied before elaborating. Following their latest stunt, the enemy family was bound to realize the culprit wasn't just some wild beast running rampant in the bog. Their first suspect would naturally be House Avalon. And technically, they'd be correct, despite the fact that Percy hadn't coordinated with his relatives. That said, they only had 5 blues, so they couldn't afford to remove them from their posts. Not even for a few days. If they did that, Baldy was guaranteed to pounce on their weakness, dealing a blow far more severe than anything Percy and Nesha had done so far. Consequently, House Tantalus only had 2 viable options. Either they'd ignore Bogside Town completely, or they'd have to send more greens if and when they could afford to spare them. What if the war ends without us knowing? Or if you've misjudged how valuable this town is? I haven't. Both their towns are valuable, but not as much as several greens, which is what they'll lose if they give my grandfather an opening. As for the war, I wouldn't worry about that. Wars all over Remir will only keep escalating until the lotus blooms. Probably for a while after that too, until all the losers are eliminated. Nesha remained silent for a few minutes, contemplating his words. In the end, she nodded, apparently not disagreeing with any of it. While she wasn't the most experienced in a fight, she probably understood politics even better than he did, having studied them her whole life. "So what's the plan then? Do we just stay here, waiting for the next green to come our way?" That sounds a little dangerous. She wasn't wrong. Even with all their preparations, Percy had barely managed to kill Broos by the skin of his teeth. The next person House Tantalus sent would be a lot stronger. For now, let's head back to the town. We need to gauge the situation there before we plan our next move. "What's there to gauge?" Nesha asked in protest. "The cat is out of the bag. The guy went into the bog, never to return. If we show up all injured after being gone for 2 days, they'll know it was us." "Of course." Percy nodded. "What I meant to say is we need to gauge their stance towards all this." Nesha tilted her head in confusion, prompting him to explain. "We'll tell them the truth. and we'll see how they react. Are you crazy? We're still in enemy territory. They'll rat us out to their masters. And that's only if they don't attack us themselves. Nesha, I don't know if you've noticed, but we've done them a favor. These people are afraid of House Tantalus. They'd have revolted a long time ago if they could. So what? You think you'll just tell them a few flowery words and get them to march behind you against a noble house? They only have a few untrained yellows and oranges. I don't need them to march behind me, or even help us against the greens, just to keep turning a blind eye to our actions. The current arrangement already works for everyone. The evil House Avalon is ambushing House Tantalus's people inside the Grizzly Bog, while the innocent commoners of Bogside Town don't know anything about it. They only need to maintain our cover as a Redborn blacksmith living with his wife, and they get to live peacefully with their loved ones. It's a win-win. Nesha shook her head. That sounds great on paper, but there are hundreds of them. All it takes is one coward to go behind everyone's back, and we'll be the ones who get ambushed. Then, it's lucky we have somebody who can recognize lies. Isn't it? Percy grinned. We just need to ask some well-placed questions here and there, and we'll know if anyone intends to snitch on us. Nesha exhaled in defeat. This wasn't the first idiotic plan Percy had forced on her, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But hey, hadn't everything turned out fine so far? Let's assume this works. We've only bought ourselves more time until the next group arrives. How do we kill them? She asked, changing the topic. Well, I've got nothing concrete just yet, but the last fight gave me a few ideas. I'll start working on a new spell as soon as I bring a couple more runes from the vault. And I'll need your help with something too. The two bid Mickey farewell before heading back. On the way, Percy brought Nesha up to speed on his plans. By the time they arrived, they'd even discussed how to approach the townsfolk. Entering the town, they made their way to the center, ignoring the gasps and exclamations of the residents. If the caked mud and bloodstains on their clothes hadn't clued them in already, the grisly trophy Percy paraded through the streets certainly did. The two only stopped once they were outside the tavern, facing a crowd of people headed by Fagin. Percy tossed Bruce's torn robes on the ground in front of them, the bloodied garments eliciting another round of sharp breaths and worried whispers from their audience. But he didn't let their growing unease deter him, looking at them confidently before speaking. My name is Percival of House Avalon. Chapter 170. Snitches and Stitches. At first, the townsfolk stared at the ill-begotten tatters of silk in stunned silence. Over the next 2 minutes, Percy watched the color drain from their faces, their eyes widening with panic. But still, nobody dared to utter a sound. It wasn't until another minute later that somebody finally broke the oppressive stillness. What have you done? A man cried, his voice quivering. Those cursed life-suckers will have our heads, another shouted. Like a spark igniting dry tinder, the second voice set the crowd alight. Mutters and whispers rippled through the gathering. Many of the residents covered their mouths as they spoke, some casting nervous glances at Percy and Nesha, while others pointed at them with trembling fingers. Soon, their fear began to transform into quiet accusations. Everyone, calm down. Fagin raised his hand, causing the chatter to die down. Then he took a step forward, approaching Percy. Young man, while I'm sure you have a lot to tell us, and, believe me, everyone here is dying to hear you out, there are a couple things I'm going to need you to clarify beforehand. Percy didn't say anything, merely nodding at the old man to speak. Is the owner of those clothes dead? Yes. And is it safe to assume the other nobles who disappeared over the past few months are too? Naturally. Or did you think they'd gathered together to have a year-long picnic in the swamp? This time it was Nesha who pitched in. Percy glared at her to drop the sarcasm. Sure, it was a dumb question, but they wanted to win these people over, not to antagonize them. Where did the outburst even come from? Is she still pissed off at them for nearly getting her killed last year? Either way, if Fagin took any offense, he didn't show it. He cleared his throat before speaking again. May I ask how this is possible? Don't take it the wrong way, but I don't think the two of you could have accomplished all this by yourselves. We aren't alone, Percy replied with a half-truth. As for the details, trust me, you're better off not knowing them. The old man nodded, clearly sharing the sentiment. He was about to say something else, but somebody from the crowd butted in again. We should hand them over. That's right. Maybe the nobles won't blame us if we distance ourselves from this. Somebody agreed. Hearing them, Percy carefully scanned the crowd, trying to discern the prevailing opinions. A few of them nodded along with the men who'd spoken, too scared to defy their masters. But the majority grimaced or clicked their tongues instead, evidently not as fond of their overlords. It was one of them who spoke next. You idiots! Can't you even recognize what's good for you? How many of our people died this year? 0, Mr. Dillon said, vouching for Percy. And he wasn't alone. Yes, I can't believe your first reaction is to sell your saviors off to those bastards. We should be building statues of them, not stabbing them in the back. You should all be ashamed of yourselves. A woman yelled, berating her neighbors. The faction opposing Percy didn't give up, though. You're acting as if they're doing this for our sake. This is nothing more than a war between two noble houses, and we're the ones caught in the middle. I've no clue who's going to win, but I'd rather not piss off the people who own us. The heated debate continued for a few minutes, as men and women from both sides argued with one another. At times, Percy was tempted to defend himself, but he ultimately held back. He figured it was best to let them speak their minds first, getting everything out there before making his case. The narrative has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. Eventually, it was Fagin who cut the discussion short. Okay, that's enough. We've heard both differing opinions, but Percy and Nesha have yet to tell us why they chose to come forward today. He turned to Percy, looking him in the eye for a second before continuing. Young man, I admit we got off on the wrong foot all those months ago, and I was the one at fault. You've done a lot of good for our town, whether it was your intention or not, but you've also kept many secrets from us and put us all at risk. Would you care to explain what you're trying to accomplish? What's there to explain? I'm glad my actions have improved your lives, but I admit that wasn't my goal in coming here. I have my own reasons for targeting House Tantalus. Like some people have said, you all just happened to get caught in the middle. So why tell us now? And what are you going to do next? Fagin asked. Are you leaving? Honestly, I'd have kept it a secret if I could. Sadly, it wasn't an option this time. But no, I've no intention of going anywhere, though that will depend on your stance. This is madness, somebody interrupted. They'll get us all killed. But Mr. Dillon slapped the guy to shut him up. Just let him finish. Seeing hundreds of pairs of eyes return to him, Percy continued. I'm not asking you to help us, nor to fight House Tantalus alongside us. Just pretend you didn't hear any of this. Let us keep doing what we've been doing in secret. That's all we want. Can you guarantee House Avalon will win? Fagin asked. Percy shook his head. Naturally not. But what difference does it make? We're the ones taking all the risk. If we lose, we die. Nobody will blame you. Not to mention, regardless of whether we win or lose, every person with the Drain bloodline we kill is one less person slaughtering your loved ones in the years to come. Basically, you only need to keep your mouth shut. Nesha jumped in. Simple enough? More chatter ensued, as the two sides argued some more, before Fagin ultimately put the issue up for a vote. In the end, the side supporting Percy and Nesha won by over 300 votes to the opposition's 25. It was an overwhelming victory, which made sense, really. The townsfolk didn't have much to lose by covering for them. Like Percy and Nesha had said, all they had to do was literally nothing, and they'd come out ahead either way. That said, 25 people were plenty enough for somebody to do something dumb and screw things for everyone. Keeping her bloodline a secret, Nesha took the opportunity during the discussions to pick those people off one by one, discreetly asking them a couple of questions here and there to determine whether they intended to behave. Well, Percy asked once they were back in their house. The girl shook her head. Like I told you, it's impossible. I've identified at least 5 people who I'm confident will screw everything up. Unless you want to try assassinating them, we should get the hell out of here. But Percy grinned. We aren't going anywhere, he said, causing Nesha to raise an eyebrow. Obviously, there was always the chance of things turning out this way, but we can make it work in our favor. What do you mean? I wasn't sure if House Tantalus would continue throwing people at us after losing Broos. Too much risk and too many unknowns. But what if they had a clearer idea of what they were getting into, and even thought they were going to catch us off guard? You're intentionally baiting them over. You want people to snitch on us, Nesha realized. Well, no. It would have been simpler if they could just do as they were told. It'll be much harder to lure the Greens over to the swamp like this. But we can give them a warm welcome here, in the town instead. Nesha gave him a long look, seemingly reevaluating the person she'd chosen to follow. But she didn't say anything. They'd already discussed several aspects of Percy's plan. The only thing left was to piece everything together. Percy didn't speak either, instead grabbing the sewing kit Mr. Dillon had generously given him earlier. Honestly, Percy had wanted to pay for it, but the man had refused to accept any money. He'd even offered to waive the cost of the pig iron in their future dealings, though Percy wasn't planning to continue posing as a blacksmith now that their cover was up. Mickey provided them with more than enough food to get by, and they no longer needed to hide their money either. Threading the needle, Percy then lifted his shirt, trying to stitch one of the nastier cuts the potions had failed to close. Having grown in a house full of life users, and then spent half a decade in a place where one could easily buy healing potions, Percy had never learned how to apply basic first aid. But how hard could it be? Yet, the moment he was about to pierce his skin, something strange happened. It was almost as if some primal instinct took over, guiding his hand forward. Before he even realized what was happening, he'd finished patching his wound up, adding 7 stitches in total. What the hell? This was easier than I thought it'd be. Thinking of something, Percy then took his shirt off, examining it closely. His fight against Broos had left it full of holes. Perhaps he was better off just buying a new one, but walking around in patched rags would better sell the image of a harmless peasant. Either way, there was something he wanted to test. Passing another linen thread into the needle, he began working on his shirt, allowing the same strange feeling to overcome him. Percy had never felt anything like that before. It was almost like he finally found his true calling after a lifetime of searching. Not even a minute later, he was done. Staring at the formerly banged-up piece of cloth, he marveled at his handiwork. One could still spot the stitches if they looked closely, but overall, the shirt had been repaired near seamlessly. Not just that, but Percy had accomplished this with the speed and efficiency more befitting of a master tailor than an amateur. Growing more and more certain of his guess, he opened his status again. As it turned out, he wouldn't have to wait that long for his answer. Spectral trait. Weaving. Chapter 171. Disgust. Percy wanted nothing more than to dive back into his work, having lots of urgent tasks to tend to. The looming threat of House Tantalus aside, there were only 9 more months until the lotus bloomed, and he wanted to return to his family by then. Sadly for him, his injured channels forced him to place everything on hold for a few more days. Unable to use mana, he couldn't condense crystals, nor cleanse his cores. Even sending out his next clone had to wait a while longer. But that didn't mean he remained completely idle. Knowing the name of his trait, he figured this was as good a time as any to explore the benefits it granted him. Of course, he still had no clue how it could possibly help him improve his magic, but there were other, mundane ways to put it to the test. To this end, he approached Leah, the lady who'd spoken for him and Nesha during the other day's discussions. Apparently, she was the town's resident tailor, the very person Nesha had purchased their clothes from, though it wasn't a wardrobe change Percy wanted from her. "Do you think I could work here for a couple of weeks?" he asked, eliciting a raised eyebrow from the woman. Naturally, she was a little surprised to see a young man, and a noble scion at that, display a sudden interest in her profession. Still, she eagerly agreed to his request as soon as her initial confusion faded, happy to help Percy after everything he'd done for the town. In fact, she offered to tutor him of her own volition, and even to pay him for his work. Suffice to say, Percy refused to take any money. Besides the fact that he didn't need it, he had no idea if he'd be any good at this. His trait might have raised his proclivity towards the art, but he wasn't sure if being a little skilled with a thread and needle would cut it. Getting some experience is more than enough. Over the next few days, Percy showed up at Leah's workshop every morning. At first, he merely watched her as she wove patches of linen, stitching them together into shirts and trousers. The outfits she crafted weren't anything special. They looked simple and unassuming, a far cry from the silken robes and elegant dresses noble men and women regularly wore. But they were certainly practical, far better suited for the difficult, laborious lives of the commoners they were meant for. "Do you want to give it a try?" she asked on the third day. Under different circumstances, Percy might have chosen to observe her for another week or two. But his channels were almost back to normal, and he knew his schedule was about to grow a lot more hectic. The more practice he got with his trait now, the better. Oh well, if I ruin the fabric, I can just pay her for the damages. Recalling the way the tailor had handled her tools, Percy set to work. The first thing he noticed was how natural it all felt. Holding the needle wasn't awkward in the slightest, and guiding the thread came with an innate understanding of how to avoid knots and tangles. Paying more attention to the process, he was surprised by the sheer dexterity and precision by which his hands moved. As was his mentor. Not wanting to freak the poor woman out too much, Percy took a step back, trying to appear more normal. He knew it wasn't his own talent at work, but the weaving trait doing most of the heavy lifting. Still, he continued to experiment a little whenever she wasn't looking. At some point, he discovered he didn't even need the needle. Somehow, he could pinch and push the end of the thread through the smallest of holes and openings with his fingers alone. It almost felt like an extension of his body, responding to his will as well as his mana did. By now, Percy would have to be a fool if he couldn't tell his skill in this profession bordered on the supernatural. If you stumble upon this narrative on Amazon, it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. Tracing his fingers along a coarse linen shirt, he could easily visualize the way the horizontal weft and vertical warp threads interlocked into its grid-like texture. More than that, he instinctively understood why they'd been woven like that, and how the slightest variation in their structure could affect the final shape and seam of the shirt. This is wild. Between my trait, Sengo's teachings, and Nesha's help, we can probably start a business empire, he chuckled. Of course, that was not to say he had nothing to learn from Leah. While he could handle fabric as naturally as breathing, there was still a lot of nuance involved in crafting a functional set of clothes. "You'll want to match the stitch to the weave," the tailor said, watching him closely. "If you just sew straight across without following the grain, the fabric will bunch up, or worse, the stitches might tear again." She advised him at some point. Well, that certainly explained why the patches he'd hastily applied to his own clothes were starting to come undone already. Whatever instincts he'd stolen from the mysterious spider, they didn't cover making clothes for people. In any case, to accommodate his rapid learning speed, Leah handed him progressively tougher tasks over the next 3 days, before culminating in his final project, weaving an entire linen shirt from scratch. It was time-consuming work, or was meant to be, in any rate, yet Percy still managed to finish it in an afternoon after putting everything the tailor had taught him into practice. Wow, how do I get more traits? He wondered, half-jokingly. He did vaguely remember he was only ever meant to absorb one, but he'd have to ask the girl about it once he figured out how to return to her world. The only thing he lamented was that his trait didn't seem to have a direct application in combat. Having achieved so much with it in a single week, he could hardly imagine how powerful he'd grow with a trait related to spellcasting. "Let's not be ungrateful," he sighed. "I didn't even know these things existed a year ago." Bidding his mentor farewell, he returned to his house. He'd agreed to drop by Leah's to help her out whenever he could, but he could no longer afford to do it full-time. "Is your little vacation over already?" Nesha asked. "More or less," he shrugged. "What's the situation with the snitches?" Percy had asked Nesha to keep an eye on the people she'd singled out. If they were right, the traitors should be leaving town soon, to report them to their masters. Of course, people did travel to and from the town every now and then, mainly to transport goods to the neighboring Grey Quarry town or House Tantalus, but such occurrences weren't that frequent. Yes, Nesha nodded. 2 of them left this morning under the pretense of transporting wheat to House Tantalus. For context, the harvest season isn't even over yet, so typically they shouldn't have done this until a couple weeks from now. Not to mention, they aren't the ones normally in charge of this. Mickey, from now on, I want you to fly in a wide circle around the town every few hours. For how long? The crow groaned. Indefinitely. We'll need to know when the greens arrive, so they don't catch us by surprise. Naturally, the bird complained. Waking up several times per night was bound to be unpleasant. Still, he agreed, not wanting Percy or Nesha to get killed in their sleep. It wasn't until all of that was settled that Percy finally activated his boosting art, sitting down to condense some crystals. As cumbersome as it was, it had grown into a bit of a habit by now. In fact, he thought he might have even missed it after not doing it for over a week. Nah, not really. Forming a blob of cyan in his hand, he soon shaped it into a solid sphere before squeezing it between his palms. Its size shrunk rapidly as Percy settled into the routine task. And a few minutes later, 7 to be exact, it was done. Percy had managed to shave a lot of time off crystallization over the years, though his improvements had already slowed down to a crawl. He estimated he wouldn't be getting much faster before yellow. Shrugging, he was about to condense another one, when he noticed something strange. A weird feeling bubbled up as he stared at the cyan orb pinched between his thumb and index finger. It was almost like disdain or disgust. Even, he frowned. What's going on? It wasn't like he'd done anything new. Nothing he hadn't done a million times before. Yet, for some reason, condensing his mana like this had felt wrong. He could instinctively tell there was a better way to do it. Suffice to say, he had no clue what it meant, but he did harbor a pretty good guess as to where this feeling was coming from. Interesting. Chapter 172. Hot or cold? Percy was dying to explore the strange feeling, but he had to finish all his chores first. He spent a couple days brewing ahead for himself and his companions. He also sent a new clone out, hopefully to the vault, but he wouldn't know that until he was back. Only then did he finally allow himself to delve into this new project. Perhaps it would lead to a dead end, but until he obtained the runes he wanted from the artificial world, he couldn't start working on his next spell upgrade anyway. Let's see. My pure mana can essentially take 4 different forms. Leaving his fused mana aside, since it was structurally identical in its corporeal phase, Percy manifested his cyan mana in all its different states, one after the other. At the same time, he allowed himself to sink into the clarity afforded to him by weaving, contemplating the feedback it provided. First, the regular mana felt soft and squishy. Trying to fashion it into any sort of solid construct was ill-advised, as Percy had found out years ago. Not that weaving was particularly constructive with its criticism. While it was happy telling Percy what it disliked about the substance, it didn't bother explaining how he was meant to fix it. Then came the crystals. Again, his trait loudly protested their creation, warning him that they were way too brittle and too rigid. He wouldn't be able to weave a web out of... Wait, what? A web? Why would I care about that? He creased his brow. Were these intrusive thoughts some side effect of the trait? Percy wasn't particularly happy evaluating his magic based on how suitable it was for catching bugs. But he shook his head, unwilling to write this path off before he even treaded it. Fine. Web it is. Let's see if I can please you. Next was the intermediate step he obtained by mixing the soft mana with the cyan powder. In his analogy to concrete, these rice-shaped grains were equivalent to the gravel that made up most of the substance. Expecting the trait to complain again, Percy was shocked to receive some positive feedback for a change. He could tell weaving still wasn't overly thrilled with the grains, but it wasn't as quick to dismiss them as before. Instead, it nudged him along, encouraging him to keep going. Weird, but okay. Finally, Percy used reinforcement. Filling the space between the grains with powder, he held everything in place with regular mana, before hammering at the mixture with his willpower, trying to lodge its pieces together. Over the next few minutes, he gradually ironed out the kinks in the material, purging its impurities one after the other. In the end, he was left with a cylindrical slab of cyan in his hand, a small section of what he usually used for his scythe shaft. It hadn't taken him too long either, as he'd grown much faster at this over the past year. How about this one? You've got to be a little impressed this time, right? It's a refined spell, for Phoebe's sake. Unfortunately, the response from Weaving was lukewarm again. It was indeed satisfied with the rod's strength, but it still protested loudly over its excessive rigidity. The greedy trait wanted its mana both strong and flexible. After all, how else would he spin it into the ultimate thread? Percy frowned. Is that the goal? I don't even know if such a thing is possible. He smiled bitterly. Who was he even talking to? Was it himself, the spider, or the trait? Either way, this was quite the high standard his customer had imposed on him. Pure mana was universally hailed as hot garbage for a reason. Percy was counting his lucky stars that he'd managed to amend that into something useful, yet Weaving demanded so much more. You might be reading a pirated copy. Look for the official release to support the author. Then again, it wasn't so strange, given the trait's name. Percy couldn't help but wonder what effect such a result would have on his magic. Could pure mana truly be as hard as steel, yet as flexible as silk at the same time? If possible, that ought to qualify as a masterful tier spell. Well, the clone won't be back for a few more days at the earliest. I suppose I've got some time to kill. From that day onward, Percy spent his mornings brewing for the group, while devoting his afternoons into researching the new form of his pure mana. As for how he did that, well, he was essentially playing a game of hot or cold with his trait. He tried applying subtle changes to his reinforcement, using the trait's reaction as well as his own intuition to assess whether they brought him closer or further from his goal. At first, he'd started with something obvious, decreasing the width of his constructs. Originally, the shaft of his scythe was about as wide as a finger, so Percy gradually reduced that a few millimeters at a time, gauging how its properties changed. Not surprisingly, the rod grew far more fragile past a certain point, namely, as soon as it had shrunk to around half its previous width. And it didn't take a genius to figure out why. If somebody was to examine the rod's cross-section, they'd quickly notice it wasn't homogeneous, as it was made of 3 different variants of pure mana, held together in a very specific configuration. Obviously, shrinking the shape too much messed up the delicate balance, compromising the object's integrity. I'll need to go deeper, Percy realized. The next step was to play around with the grains themselves, adjusting their shape, which was easier said than done, as even the slightest tweak affected the construct greatly. For example, making the grains thinner allowed Percy to fit more of them in the rod's cross-section, which was good, but it also made each individual grain more fragile, which was bad. The solution was to make them shorter too, maintaining their rice-like shape while scaling them down. However, the shorter they were, the harder it was for them to interlock with one another, which again compromised the integrity of the material. To amend that, Percy tried making them thinner while packing them more densely, to counterbalance their fragility. This worked, but it made the rod even more rigid. It wouldn't bend at all. Well, this wasn't what my trait wanted, but I suppose it isn't useless. I can make my scythes a little stronger like this. In any case, Percy had to admit this wasn't going to work with just 3 ingredients. The only way forward was to add another intermediate step in the process, giving himself an extra variable to play around with. However, this also meant that the number of possible combinations would shoot up exponentially, as would the effort required to sift through each of them. Not seeing any other path, and since his clone had yet to return, he gritted his teeth before diving into the experiments again. This time, he used 2 grain variants. One was small and sturdy, the other long and thin. This seemed to yield some results, as he did manage to shrink the rod some more by the end of the 2nd week. Even better, he did that without compromising its strength. At least, not by much. He thought as he examined the long, cyan fiber in his hand. Its cross-section was smaller than a ladybug, and it seemed to bend rather easily too, A few quick tests confirmed that it wasn't any weaker than his scythe shaft either. Percy had verified this by stacking a few of them together and then comparing how much force it took to break them. Still nowhere close to my goal though. As it was, he couldn't think of a good application for it. It wasn't nearly as thin as a thread, so the prospect of weaving it into a fabric was nothing but a pipe dream. Shrinking it down any further wasn't going to be easy either. There's no way I'll have it ready by the time the greens arrive. I suppose I'll have to fall back to my original plan. He'd have to put this project on the side for now. For all he knew, it might be years until he got anywhere with it. The realization filled him with disappointment, as he'd been looking forward to perfecting the mana threads. Perhaps it was the thought of obtaining a masterful spell, or maybe it was just the trait's influence on his subconscious, but he'd really enjoyed the past couple of weeks. Sadly, it couldn't be helped. On the bright side, the clone finally returned a few days later, and it brought with him exactly what Percy had ordered. Finally, he had some shiny new runes to play around with. Chapter 173, Rune Delivery Service. The clone's memories settled in place, the events of the past few weeks rapidly flashing through Percy's mind. This time, he'd ended up in the body of a semi-sentient for a change. It was a weird, gnoll-like creature, some kind of ugly humanoid raccoon. Not his finest moment, but that didn't detract from the novelty of the experience in the slightest. Suffice to say, the creature's tribe was quite primitive. They couldn't even communicate without grunts and growls, nor did they have much of a civilization going for them. In the few hours Percy had deigned to spend there, he determined they couldn't even build their own houses. Instead, they lived in caves, using only the most rudimentary tools made of sharpened stones and rugged bones. Of course, Percy didn't leave immediately. He did spend an afternoon or so exploring the surrounding area, as he always did, in case there was anything of note. As it turned out, the mountain inhabited by his people was surrounded by a dense, fairly normal-looking forest, brimming with wildlife not unlike something one might see on Remir. As he traveled through the exotic woods, he made a point to forage for any edible fruit and nuts he stumbled upon, tossing them in a large piece of some animal's hide he'd borrowed from the cave. In the end, he didn't find any traces of sentient life, nor any treasure worth his time. His status didn't contain anything particularly important either, just his host's orange grade and fire affinity, along with the other regulars. It was worth a shot. Shrugging, he activated Metatron's decree, throwing his supplies in before jumping after them, as was his original plan. Soon, he found himself lying on the familiar metallic floor, boxed inside the world-sized cube. Honestly, he half expected Metatron to show up, giving him a piece of his mind. Though that didn't happen. A quick check also revealed the Titan hadn't revoked his access to the life mana necessary for his second core. I guess he didn't take the parrot's condition personally. Percy exhaled in relief. In any case, he had no intention of using the mana, as he wouldn't have enough time to awaken the core anyway. Nor did he plan to try his luck in the orange challenges either. Maybe he could have cleared a couple if he did his best, but he was on a tight schedule. Can I give Gabe the mana since I don't want it? He wondered. Percy had never forgotten about his friend's crippling disabilities. Walking to the residential area, he soon met up with him, bringing him up to speed on the recent developments. You mean you can just waltz in with a random body once a week and ask the system to give you 1,000,000 refills of life mana? Just like that? Hey! You're making it sound like I'm fleecing the guy or something. Percy rolled his eyes. Last time I only got 500 credits or so. Anyway, want me to ask if I can transfer the privilege to you this once? I was also thinking of maybe pooling resources together, so we don't have to buy the same books twice. Percy didn't even get to complete his sentence before all the runes in their surroundings flashed red, the system berating him in a scathing tone. Warning. Unauthorized exchange detected. Registered users are not allowed to exchange credits, information, or other resources without permission. Calculating penalty. Ah, that's my fault, Gabe said. I should have warned you about it. Last time, I checked with the cube if I was allowed to lend you a couple of books. It didn't seem to mind as you were still registered as a guest. Calculation complete. User's first infraction detected. Penalty reduced to 1 infraction point. Total infraction points, 1. Wow. Just wow. What this place needs is a stinginess challenge. You lot would never have to worry about credits again. Percy groaned. The narrative has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the infringement. That said, he wasn't too surprised by this development. If the vault's residents were allowed to freely exchange information between themselves, everyone would be doing it. That would only undermine the entire point of the challenges, to motivate the most talented people to grow while weeding out the weaklings. Part of him wanted to slap himself for not abusing his guest status some more back when he had the chance. But deep down, he knew Metatron wouldn't have allowed that. Not if his goal was to entice him into joining the vault. What do these points even do? Well, normally each point lasts 50 years. If you accumulate 3, you get executed. That said, I'm not sure what's going to happen in your case, though I doubt Metatron will let you get away without any consequences. Gabe explained. 3, huh? There's still some room for. Don't even think about it. You're lucky the cube only gave you 1 this time. It's usually not as lenient. Percy swallowed hard, realizing that most of the vault's residents got killed if they broke the rules once or twice. Sadly, there was nothing he could do about it for now. Bidding his friend farewell, he then returned to the challenge cube, beginning the Orange Manuscript Challenge. He didn't intend to complete it, but learning how the requirements scaled from one grade to the next would be useful. Besides, this was the best place to get some privacy unless he wanted to rent a room. Draw any 5 runes 500 times in total in under 10,000 writs, with at least a 95% success rate. Each individual rune has to be drawn at least 50 times. Not as bad as I was expecting. Percy raised an eyebrow. It turned out that the first wave of the orange level was somewhere between the 3rd and 4th waves of the red level in difficulty. He could already draw the concealment, preservation, and control runes well enough, so he'd only need 2 more to pass. Maybe it's worth a try then? In any case, he'd have to practice with the new runes anyway. Plus, it wouldn't hurt to pile up some more credits for his next visit. Making his mind up, Percy then browsed the system for the runes his main body had requested. Of course, he didn't know exactly what he'd find. He'd only come here with a vague idea of what he wanted, but the enchantments sounded simple enough that they should exist. I should still buy that rune index as soon as I can afford it. I can't spend hours browsing blindly every time. That said, he did eventually find what he needed. This time, he'd settled on 7 books on 3 different runes, costing 70 credits in total. The first 2 were for his own use, the hardness and absorption runes. Percy wanted to include both of them in his new spell, but he didn't have any special mana type requirements this time, so he'd only get 2 tomes on each. That should be more than enough to settle on a couple variants he liked. As for the final rune, he needed it to work with space mana again, as it was meant for Nesha. This wasn't part of their preparations for the upcoming fight, just the next step in her studies to craft a spatial amulet. The stability rune was a key component of the artifacts, as it ensured the pocket dimension could safely store objects for a prolonged period of time. Percy was going to look through 3 tomes on it, picking the most suitable variant. It's a pity I can't use it in the challenge. He would still have to memorize it by the end of his trip, but he couldn't activate the stability rune without space mana. Alright, just buy those. I want them in hard copy format. Confirmed. Deducting credits. New balance 109. Delivery in 6 writs. Percy didn't waste a second before diving into the stack of books. The hardness rune he ended up picking consisted of a single circle, with several progressively smaller hexagons nested inside one another. Not the toughest shape to draw. Even better, he estimated he wouldn't have much trouble visualizing its effect, as he could simply focus on his reinforced constructs, doubling down on their existing properties. As for the absorption rune, it was a little trickier to learn, as he didn't have a very clear image of how it would work in his mind. Absorption runes came in all shapes and sizes, from heat absorption to light absorption, to sound absorption and so on. What Percy wanted was a relatively simple force absorption variant that worked with pure mana. Overall, mastering the new runes was relatively straightforward. Getting them to the level the challenge wanted took a bit longer, but he figured he'd have to put in the effort back home anyway if he didn't do it here. So, he simply gritted his teeth for a few more days until… Congratulations! Wave 1 has been cleared. Calculating rewards. Awarded credits. 100. Current balance. 209. Percy finally had enough credits for the index, though he wouldn't have any left for the next runes if he bought it now. Deciding to postpone it once more, he quickly checked the second wave's requirements. Draw any 10 runes 1,500 times in total, in under 20,000 writs, with at least a 95% success rate. Each individual rune has to be drawn at least 100 times. Yeah, I think we're done here. The darn thing was even tougher than the fourth wave of the red level. Shaking his head, he finally allowed the ethereal cord to pull him out of the gnoll's body, letting Metatron do whatever the hell he wanted with his new toy as he drifted back towards Remir. Percy opened his eyes, a smile tugging at his lips as he pondered over his latest acquisitions. His new spell would involve quite a few moving parts, but it should massively raise his survivability even against a green once he got it to work. Time to forge myself some armor. Chapter 174. Gauntlet. Percy's efforts to use his mana defensively dated as far back as his first month in the Alchemist's Guild, when he developed his glove spell. That said, the flimsy layer of Cyan mana had never been particularly impressive. Back then, he hadn't even known about reinforcement. Not to mention, his second core had still been at red. Consequently, the crude spell was arguably the least impressive entry in Percy's status to this very day. I suppose it's time to do something about it. He grinned. Of course, there were plenty of obstacles standing between him and his vision for the new spell. For one, he had to navigate around the contradictory requirements that any piece of defensive gear had. Namely, it had to be strong enough to resist an enemy's attack, while at the same time being flexible enough to not inhibit its wearer's movements. The good news was that Percy had already taken this into consideration back in the day, learning how to properly distribute the mana around the spell for this exact reason. Gathering some mana from his abdomen, he instinctively allowed it to wrap around his hand, forming the construct. Having used the spell countless times, it no longer even required much thought to summon it, though it had admittedly been a while since he last needed it. In any case, he flexed his fingers a little as he closely examined the construct, reminding himself how he had designed the thinner layer of psi and to coat his joints, allowing them to bend more easily. At the same time, he'd made the rest of the structure thicker, thus offering better protection. Sadly, adding reinforcement will only complicate things, he grimaced. Obviously, if he wanted the spell to survive a green's attack, using the stronger variant of his pure mana was a no-brainer. Unfortunately, that wouldn't work for the joints as it would make them way too rigid regardless of how thin he made it. And he couldn't even make it too thin, as he'd recently found out the hard way. Suffice to say, the only solution would be to use both his soft and hard mana, and to ensure the spell transitioned seamlessly between the two. If only I had managed to get the threads to work, this wouldn't be a problem. He sighed. The magical silk his trait had commissioned would be the perfect fit for this spell. Sadly, there was no way he'd complete the ambitious project anytime soon. Then again, it wasn't the end of the world. Practicing how to smoothly blend the soft and hard mana together would only help with that. Alright, let's get started then. Walking over to a corner of the room, he picked up a large clay jar. It was old, dusty, and unassuming, exactly how he wanted it. Removing its lid, he peered into the seemingly empty vessel. The only things one could see were a couple of concealment runes he'd carved along the inner walls of the jar. However, not everything was as it seemed. Suddenly, a flash of teal shone within the clay jar, illuminating its dark belly. A fine powder of the same color soon manifested out of thin air. This was one major advantage the teal powder had compared to the cyan variant. It was easier to hide. Naturally, Percy would have preferred to keep all his valuables inside his spatial amulet, but he couldn't fit everything. Definitely not the large stash of powder he'd prepared for both his elixirs and his weapons. That had left him no choice but to get a little creative with his hiding spots. Shrugging, he pinched a handful of the substance, before pulling some more pure mana from his abdomen, blending the two. Obviously, mixing fused and unfused mana together meant the resulting constructs couldn't be made invisible or intangible anymore. Doing that would only result in the spells crumbling apart. But he didn't need to worry about that right now. The story has been illicitly taken. Should you find it on Amazon, report the infringement. Condensing a few rice-shaped grains, he next mixed all 3 types of mana, before wrapping them around his free hand. Next, he placed his hands side by side, comparing the two as he started working on the upgrade. Let's see. That part is supposed to be harder. That segment has to be a little shorter or I won't be able to bend my thumb. At first, he focused on distributing the mana properly, determining how much he'd need in each region for reinforcement. Only once he was happy with that did he begin hammering at it with his willpower, forging the harder pieces in the correct shapes. Crafting the upgraded glove took much longer than the Soul Harvester. While it only needed a fraction of the mana, its structure was many times more complicated, as it involved over 15 different pieces. And Percy had to work on each of them separately. In fact, he even discarded a few, recreating them from scratch after realizing he'd made a mistake. By the time he was done, the sun was already down. Still, Percy wasn't satisfied with the result. At first glance, it appeared exactly like how he'd imagined it. In fact, he was confident it would probably survive a yellow spell too. Plus, he didn't have much trouble flexing his fingers. However, there was a different issue with it. It looks great right now. But what happens when I let go of the soft mana? Withdrawing his hold over the soft mana, he watched all the connecting tissue of the glove crumble into motes of cyan. With nothing linking the hard pieces together, they began to fall apart, a couple of the fingertip guards making crisp sounds as they hit the floor. I guess there's nothing I can do about it. I'll have to actively hold everything in place during a battle. It wasn't ideal, but only the crystallized and reinforced variants of his mana could survive on their own for a prolonged period of time. Though it wasn't that bad. He already had to manually keep the regular glove active. He'd just have to do the same with its upgrade. I should still adjust its shape into something more practical, so that it's not a pain in the ass to wear. Over the past few days, Percy had modified the regular glove spell, making it even thinner than before. The idea was to wear it underneath the harder pieces, and to design everything so that it slid together nicely. That way, it would only take him a few seconds to equip it before a battle. He even added a few small holes in the harder pieces, so that he could fasten them in place with a few strings of soft mana. After he was satisfied with the new glove's practicality, he fine-tuned its design some more. He strengthened some pieces here and there, shrinking or reshaping a few others, to maximize its defensive capabilities while keeping it comfortable to wear. In the end, he even added a couple more components, such as a wristband and a forearm protector, to extend the protection it afforded all the way to his elbow. This is a good start, but still problematic, he thought as he scanned his armored hand. There was no doubt in his mind the spell was already usable in a fight, but neither he nor his status were satisfied enough with it to declare it as such. After all, it currently took him several hours to forge all the components, and it would only survive a few days at best. That meant he'd have to keep replacing it over and over again, something he had no intention of doing. Not only that, but he didn't think it was strong enough to endure a green spell just yet, which was a problem because he'd already graduated from yellows. That said, Percy had already foreseen both of these problems, and he'd come up with a solution: runes. Allowing the soft mana to fizzle out again, he removed the pieces one by one, laying them on a table in front of him. Next, he picked one of the smallest components up, one of the pinky guards, before willing the mana to shatter. Collecting the scattered powder, he then pulled some mana from both cores, fusing it together before mixing the soft teal mana with the dust of the same color. This time, he intended the construct to last a couple of weeks, so he was going to do it properly. Replicating his previous steps, he soon reforged the piece exactly like before, with 2 small additions. Careful to not compromise the spell's integrity, he embroidered 2 circular symbols on it. Within its inner wall, he added a preservation rune, to ensure the construct survived a while longer than normal. On its exterior, he instead added a hardness rune, which should elevate the construct's rigidity somewhat, allowing it to endure stronger attacks. Whether this would be enough against a green remained to be seen, but Percy had a few more tricks up his sleeve. Alas, those were for later. Breaking and reforging the pieces one by one, he then finally slotted them back onto his arm, fixing them in place with some soft teal mana once more. Only when he was done did he lift his arm, marveling at his handiwork. And the status didn't miss its cue either, announcing his achievement. Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Glove, Crew Dash, Phantom Gauntlet, Refined. Chapter 175. Just getting started. Wow, that looks like quite the spell. Nesha pitched in. You haven't seen anything yet. Percy grinned. Reaching into the mana around his arm, he willed one of its properties to shift. Without warning, the entire gauntlet vanished into thin air, causing Nesha's eyes to widen. She opened her mouth, seemingly about to ask, though she held herself back. She knew enough about Percy's magic by now to figure out what he'd done. It's still visible through mana sense, she noted after a second. Of course, though I've thought of a way around that. I'll work on it later. Nesha nodded, but she didn't say anything. Next, Percy tried to make the gauntlet incorporeal, though that didn't go nearly as nicely as he had expected. Having failed to time all 18 or so transitions properly, he watched the pieces of the gauntlet fall apart as they lost contact with one another in several spots. Hearing Nesha chuckle, he rolled his eyes. This last bit might require some more practice. At any rate, this would only be useful if he had to defend against a soul user. Percy, I don't want to rain on your parade right after you upgraded a spell, but I don't think this is enough for you to survive against a green by yourself. We don't even know how many they'll send this time. Why not? I can just point my hand at their spells and block them with my amazing gauntlet. Come on, be serious. What's the plan here? Nesha asked, not buying his bullshit. All right, just lighten up a little. He shrugged. Who said this is all I've got? Nesha, the Vault of Magic is a treasure trove of runes. Meaning, I'm just getting started. Percy stared at his gauntlet's pieces in its deconstructed form. Technically, it was already usable like this, but he had much greater plans for the spell. Like he'd told Nesha, he'd worked hard to master several runes from the vault, and it would be a waste if he only used the preservation and hardness runes on it. Of course, Percy had yet to delve into Magiscript proper, so he wasn't able to merge multiple runes into the same enchantment. The solution had been to engrave the two runes on different sides of the object, applying one to the interior while leaving the other for the exterior. Sadly, his gauntlet had already run out of surfaces for him to draw on. For now, pinching some teal powder from his trusty jar, he mixed some soft mana with it as he used reinforcement once more, shaping it into a new piece. It took him several minutes until he was satisfied, but he eventually moved it close to his eyes, a grin tugging at his lips. It was a circular band similar to the pieces that went around his finger segments, yet this one was a little wider, as if it was meant to loop around them. Picking one of the previous components from the table, he pushed it inside the new one, rotating it at the same time. A few teeth in the interior of the wider band slid right through the nooks Percy had carved in the other one, as the two objects joined together with a satisfying click. Fit perfectly. Even the two sets of holes on the pieces aligned nicely. Those were there for the teal strings to pass through, fastening the bands to the rest of the gauntlet. Unauthorized use. This story is on Amazon without permission from the author. Report any sightings. Nodding in satisfaction, Percy examined the structure once more, verifying there was nothing out of place. The two bands didn't have exactly the same shape, the second one extending a little further back, resembling a spiky scale. That way, it would even cover the joints somewhat, protecting them without inhibiting them much. R&B. And now I can add more runes on it. By adding a second layer to the band, Percy had just created two new sides waiting to be engraved. Naturally, one of them would have to be adorned with the preservation rune again. It had to be present on every single piece to ensure their longevity, but that still left him one free slot. Of course, he didn't bother drawing the runes right now. He still had plenty more pieces to perfect. Besides, his armor would probably end up replaced a dozen times over before he needed it. His eyes shifted to the next piece, as he picked up another handful of powder from the jar, resuming his work. I wish it wasn't such a tedious process, though, he sighed. Besides the ridiculous amount of time required to prepare the new spell, its greatest downside was arguably the sheer amount of teal powder he needed for all the pieces. If he had to condense them on the spot, Percy would easily need a week just for that. The good news is that it can be recycled. While he had to reforge his gauntlet every few weeks, he didn't have to keep condensing new crystals. Well, besides the ones he needed for the elixirs. Suffice to say, the contents of his jar were immensely valuable for him, as they represented several months of accumulation. I might be the only mage on Remier who has to carry ingredients around to use his spells. He smiled bitterly. Regardless, he knew it was worth it. Based on what he'd learned in the vault, a rune's effect largely depended on the grade of the one who drew it. Given Remier's underdeveloped runecrafting techniques, it would take a green or even a blue to match the potency of Percy's enchantments. By that point, the runes wouldn't be effective enough for them to rely on during a fight, which was why he'd never heard of anybody else carrying enchanted equipment. I'm sure there are some worlds out there where it's more common. In any case, Percy donned his gauntlet once more, all 54 pieces of it, marveling at its improvements again. He had actually not stopped at the second layer, instead opting to add a third one on top. He could have pushed it further, in theory, but at this point he'd already have to spend a huge amount of time maintaining all the pieces. Besides, he was swiftly approaching the limits of how bulky it could get without starting to bog him down during a fight. That said, the imposing teal gauntlet now had several spiky protrusions covering each joint like a dragon's scales, all of them adorned with runes. Percy had even reordered them, deciding to keep the force absorption enchantments in the deepest layer to mitigate the impacts his body received. As for the hardness runes, he'd moved them to the middle layer to protect the armor itself. The only layer that wouldn't be protected was the outermost one, but that one had a different purpose. Turning the construct invisible, he looked at Nesha. Well, how is it? The girl squinted as she circled Percy. Presumably, she'd activated her mana sense too. It wasn't until half a minute later that she replied. I can tell something's off, but only because I'm actively looking for it. It's not immediately obvious. Percy nodded. Naturally, he'd engraved concealment runes all over the third layer. While his runecrafting technique had plenty of room for improvement, it was more than enough to hide the construct from plain sight. Neat! He exclaimed, taking it all in. Getting this far had taken him weeks, but Percy thought the result was worth it. And, apparently, his status agreed. Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Phantom Gauntlet, Refined Phantom Scale Gauntlet, Refined. This was his second spell to evolve while remaining within the confines of the Refined tier, the other being Synchronization. Percy had no idea where Refined spells ended and Masterful spells began, but this had to mean he was getting closer, right? Percy, I still don't see how a gauntlet is going to help you, Nesha said, bursting his bubble. It'll be plenty together with the other pieces. Other pieces? Was that your goal? Nesha seemed taken aback. We don't have time for this. It's been weeks since those people snitched on us. The Greens might be here any day now, but Percy wasn't deterred. Like I said, if we get attacked before we're ready, we'll just abort the operation. Mickey is still regularly patrolling the area around the town. He'll spot them hours before they reach us. Do you actually think you'll have a full set of armor ready in time? Probably, he shrugged. The gauntlet was the hardest piece by far. It's full of joints and required dozens of pieces. The rest of the armor should be much simpler. I'll have everything done in a couple of weeks. Seeing she wasn't convinced, he continued. Nesha, House Tantalus can't just send a group of Greens whenever they want. I'm more worried they won't take the bait in the end. If they do you think our preparations will be enough? She asked. Did you finish enchanting those slabs of stone I gave you? He asked back. Yes. Then, they'll be enough. Chapter 176. Stitching. Percy had chosen a red host this time. The lower grade might be a little annoying, but this was the first soul he found today that was both sentient and in a relatively decent condition, right past the threshold where it could be possessed. Naturally, he wasn't planning to return to the vault just yet. His main body was still busy finishing up the armor spell. In fact, Percy had decided to not bother with the artificial world again until all the madness surrounding the Lotus died down a little. There was no point, as he had plenty of other things to be working on in the meantime. "Hello? Anyone there?" he asked once he found himself inside his new vessel. Who are you?" A timid voice rang in his mind. It sounded young too. "Oh shit! Did I finally stumble upon a regular person?" Percy was ecstatic to get a normal response for a change. Not an overly defensive outburst like Mickey's, or a snarky remark like Gabe's, or a brain-dead host like Takeo. Just somebody asking the obvious questions. "My name's Percy," he replied. "Do you understand what happened to you?"
I'm Enki Kropka.
The child then remained silent for a few seconds, seemingly recalling his circumstances. I was playing around the marble reef when something bit me. I didn't think much of it at first, but I started feeling a little sick at some point. I tried rushing back to the orphanage, and then, the next thing I remember is you." Listening to his host, Percy felt his metaphorical heart clench. The poor kid was just out having some fun when disaster struck. While it was nice they weren't being hunted by an enemy or anything of the sort, he wasn't sure how much of a problem the venom in their veins would pose moving forward. "All right, first things first. I'll try to patch our souls up so we can move around. We'll deal with your physical condition later, but I'll need your cooperation for this. Is that okay?" The boy sent a mental nod back, which was more than enough for his soul's innate resistance to disappear, allowing Percy to interact with it more easily. Scanning the soul, Percy was somewhat surprised at how little damage the poison had caused. The cracks were admittedly quite deep, but they were also narrow and fairly scarce. As far as he could tell, Enki could have probably survived this on his own, had he been a bit luckier. And now, he's going to die regardless of what I do, Percy thought grimly. He could patch the boy's soul temporarily, but unless they found an external source of soul mana later, Enki wouldn't survive. Percy still had no idea what kind of world he'd found himself in, or if they had any soul healers available, but from his past experience, he didn't think their odds were great. "I can't let that happen. Should I try healing him myself?" he suddenly thought. It was more than a long shot. It easily bordered on impossible. Percy had never succeeded in healing his host's souls before. It took way too much mana for his measly stash. If he tried to do this instead of patching the boy up, he'd probably fail, wasting his opportunity here. Of course, he had no idea if there was anything of value in this world, but that was how all his clones started out. That said, the thought of putting his gains before the boy's life left a sour taste in his mouth. Besides, there was technically no better patient to experiment on than Enki. The kid was only at red, which meant his soul would need the least possible amount of mana to heal. Even better, his injuries were less severe than most of his hosts. If he couldn't heal this boy, he wouldn't be able to heal anybody. "All right, I'll give it a shot. Worst case scenario, it's still valuable practice." Pulling a trickle from his stash, he guided it to one of the cracks. Using Mend, he directed the mana along the wound's surface, pouring it in several interspaced locations. The crack wanted to drink the mana up directly, but Percy held it back, forcing it to work on the soul's natural regeneration instead, just like the mysterious girl had taught him. This story has been unlawfully obtained without the author's consent. Report any appearances on Amazon. It worked. A few tiny tendrils sprouting like blades of grass after a spring rain. But this was never going to be enough. I've already spent quite a chunk of mana, for so little. No way I can close all the wounds like this. Yet, just when he was starting to reconsider his decision, something strange happened. A primal instinct kicked in, forcing him to yank the thin tendrils up, pouring more mana in them. At first, Percy panicked, thinking he'd gone crazy. If this kept going, he'd waste even more of his stash for nothing.
Yeah.
He was about to stop himself when his instinct intensified, causing another unexpected change. Percy felt his soul squirm and shift, seemingly transforming in some manner. The whole thing was extremely uncomfortable, as if somebody was bending his limbs the wrong way, trying to mold them into a weird shape. Except, there was no bone or flesh inside his soul wisp, so it didn't hurt. He couldn't actually see what was happening, but he could almost swear his soul had just sprouted a dozen thin, insect-like legs. Each of them pounced greedily on the tendrils, grabbing them and pulling them, and spinning them to their liking. Percy might have thrown up had it been an option, but he stopped fighting back, letting his soul do as it pleased. By now, he'd be a fool if he didn't know what had caused this. What the hell? Is my trait acting up again? Apparently, Weaving had a few more surprises for him than he had initially expected. Of course, he still had no idea how it could possibly help in this situation, but the trait had never given him any reason to mistrust it in the past. Besides, Enki was doomed anyway, unless he found a way to save him. Over the next few minutes, Percy observed his own soul as it cultivated the tendrils in the boy's soul, growing them longer still, knitting them together into a weird structure. His original plan had been to stick them to the opposite side, and then fill in the gaps between them as the girl had shown him. But this wasn't what his trait was doing. Instead, it treated the tendrils like wool, trying to guide them into a strange shape. Some kind of spider web, perhaps? How would such a thing even help? That said, it was too late to give up just now, as he had already invested a hefty sum of mana into this. Letting the trait fully take over, Percy fell into a trance, watching it as it continued working on its bizarre task. More and more tendrils grew from the wound, soon joining the others in the complicated tapestry. As Percy's mind struggled to make sense of its ill-defined shape, he barely even registered when the trait was done, finally pulling at all the loose ends, bringing the two chunks of Enki's soul closer together. At the same time, the mind-bending shape folded and rotated upon itself, as all the contours settled in place. It was only now that Percy finally recognized the pattern too. Evidently, his trait hadn't worked in a vacuum, drawing inspiration from some unknown dimension. No, everything it had done, it had pulled it straight out of Percy's mind, manifesting an enchantment he was intimately familiar with, having spent hundreds upon hundreds of hours drawing it during the past year. A preservation rune, and, evidently, weaving the enchantment out of Enki's very soul, had made it a dozen times more potent than anything Percy could have accomplished with his limited mana. As soon as it took shape, the rune bathed both of their souls in a gentle radiance, slowing their decay noticeably. At the same time, the boy's soul passively absorbed whatever scant motes of mana neared the wound, using them to bolster its own recovery. The improvements were minuscule, but between the more efficient recovery brought about via the mend spell and the potent preservation afforded by the rune, the healing is outpacing the decay. I think the boy will recover by himself given enough time. The importance of this breakthrough could hardly be overstated. This time, Percy had only managed to apply it to a red kid in a relatively salvageable condition, but who was to say what he could accomplish in the future, given more practice and more mana? Like this, he might be able to save his hosts from certain death, doing some real good wherever he visited. Well, let's not get ahead of myself. The boy is still dying, he reminded himself, dousing his bubbling enthusiasm. He'd only healed a single crack so far, and it had already cost him around 10% of his stash. Plenty of wounds remained, and he'd have to tend to them even more efficiently if he hoped to save Enki in time. Diving back into his work, this time with newfound purpose, he worked in tandem with his trait, using Enki's soul as the very fabric to weave his enchantments. Everywhere he touched, the tendrils bent and stretched and interwove with one another, bringing the runes to life. I can't believe this actually worked. Percy paused at some point, examining Enki's soul. It still looked a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, but it felt a lot more stable. Naturally, he hadn't managed to salvage every single piece. A few were either too damaged or too small for him to properly stitch together. Not to mention that his mana was already running dangerously low. That said, he was confident he had done enough for the boy to survive. Pride and relief blended together, fanning the flames of triumph in Percy's heart. And his status seemed to share in his excitement. Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Mend Crude-Spectral Art. Soul Stitching Refined. Chapter 177. EA's Gift. Spectral art, huh? Evidently, involving one's trait in their magic resulted in yet another flavor of spell. In any case, Percy was glad weaving had more to offer than just the long-term project he was working on. What did you do? I can feel my body again, Enki suddenly exclaimed, bringing him out of his thoughts. It was only now that Percy remembered he had yet to link himself to his host properly. Finding a few still open cracks, he slid through as many of them as he could, the boy's senses finally feeding into his mind. The first thing he noticed was cold all around him, coupled with an oppressive pressure trying to squeeze him into a ball. Luckily, his host's body seemed to have been perfectly designed to survive in this exact environment. Twitching his fingers, he explored the resistance some more, determining they were probably underwater. It wouldn't be his first time possessing a sea dweller, but it was his first sentient one. Opening his eyes, he saw nothing but darkness. A few faint shapes settled in place a moment later, the exotic landscape beneath him softly illuminated by a dim red glow burning somewhere in the distance like a dark sun. To his left, Percy spotted a large, forest-like structure, though there weren't any trees inside it, but rather a series of huge, pale corals. Was this the marble reef the boy had mentioned? Then came the pain. It mostly originated from his chest, an agonizing jolt branching outwards to his extremities with every thrum of his heart. Enki, I fixed your soul, but your body is still a mess. If they really have an antidote for whatever bit you in that orphanage of yours, I suggest you get a move on. Nodding grimly, the boy took control of his body, shooting towards a certain direction like an arrow. Percy was taken aback by the sheer elegance and speed of his host's strokes, having never seen anybody swim like that before. He felt the water press against the membranes between his digits, as Enki wormed his way through the cold abyss. Even at Orange and with his boosting art active, Percy doubted he'd be able to keep up with the boy in his natural environment. Along the journey, he marveled at the native flora and fauna, ranging from the deep-sea fish with luminescent lobes and mouths full of needle-like fangs, to the strangely shaped chunks of algae drifting aimlessly in the darkness, to the exotic crab-like creatures grazing the cold seabed, only visible through faint reflections captured by their smooth shells. Eventually, Enki reached some kind of town. Surprisingly, the place didn't look much different from what somebody might find on land. All the buildings were made of carved chunks of stone, though they were decorated by glowing pearls of all colors and sizes, illuminating everything. One important difference was that they didn't have any streets, or even doors for that matter, as people here clearly didn't need to walk on the ground. Instead, they swam from building to building, entering through the wide windows. The people themselves looked vaguely humanoid, though their skin was a pale bluish color. All of them sported the same membranes between their clawed digits as his host, a set of gills decorating the sides of their necks, allowing them to breathe. Their clothes weren't anything special. All of them donned simple seaweed skirts, only a touch more intricate than what he'd personally crafted for his monkey host a few months back. Other than covering their privates, they didn't seem to be interested in fashion, most of them leaving their chests bare. The one detail that really drew Percy's attention was their eyes, however, and it only captured his attention more than everything else, because of a simple reason: the strange dichotomy he spotted. 9 out of 10 locals seemed to have a regular-looking pair of eyes, the irises colored in a bright topaz color, split down the middle with a vertical pupil. But every now and then, he spotted somebody who stood out from the rest, their eyes glowing in a bright pale light. Yeah, that's not normal. Clearly, there's some kind of magic in place. In any case, this wasn't the time for sightseeing, he reminded himself. Enki had already slowed down greatly, and it seemed the boy was having trouble breathing. Evidently, he was close to having another episode, caused by the deadly venom that had claimed his life once already. The locals gave them concerned glances, but Enki just ignored them, his eyes fixated on a large building in the distance. It wasn't until he drew nearer that he slowed down some more, this time not due to his affliction, just so that he wouldn't crash into something. Find this and other great novels on the author's preferred platform. Support original creators. Entering through a window on the second, maybe third level, the boy hastily swam through the winding corridors of the sunken structure. Many people seemed to recognize him, but he didn't have time to greet them as he continued swimming, aided only by the gentle glow of the pearls adorning the walls. Only once they reached a certain person did Enki finally stop. She appeared to be a woman, her features slightly softer than many of the other locals they'd seen on the way. What's more, some fond feelings seeped through their bond. Apparently, the boy saw her as some kind of mother figure. "Enki, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Not that Percy would have known, had it not been for his connection to his host. These people seemed to communicate in a very strange manner, a few gurgles escaping their throat as a high-pitched sound rippled outwards with each spoken word. In any case, the boy remained silent, merely pointing at a nasty-looking bite mark marring his lower calf, some brownish blood slowly oozing out. Gesturing towards a bed, the woman directed them to lie down, helping them strap themselves in place so they wouldn't float away. Next, she approached them after preparing a syringe filled with a deep purple liquid. "Enki, please ask her if this contains any life mana." The boy raised an eyebrow but still did as he was told. "No, it's just the antidote," the woman said, forcing a strained smile. Then, she injected them without delay, probably recognizing they were running out of time. Only once every last drop of the liquid was flowing through Enki's veins did she take a moment to explain a couple things. Apparently, the heart-stopping venom of the marble-dwelling eels wasn't that difficult to counteract. Beyond that, the boy shouldn't have much trouble recovering by himself.
Epsilon.
Percy merely sighed in relief, but he didn't say anything. As long as they didn't have to go through the greedy second core waiting restlessly in their abdomen, they should be fine. It wasn't until a few hours later, after the pain had already begun to die down, and the danger looming over their head had largely passed, that Enki seemed to remember the passenger in his mind. "So, Percy, now that that's settled, mind telling me what's up with you?" Percy shrugged. "Long story short, I bounce from body to body looking for new magical knowledge. You just happen to be the latest one. Then you're out of luck." The boy smiled bitterly. "I've never practiced magic much. As you know, the fire affinity is by far the weakest one. I can't even hold a tiny flame for longer than a second before it gets extinguished. Is it because of the environment here?" Percy guessed. The question caused Enki's eyes to widen, however. "Don't tell me? Are you a land dweller by any chance?" the boy suddenly asked, a wave of excitement seeping through their bond. "Is this your first time meeting one?" "Yes," Enki nodded. "There's no land on Atlantis. Our entire world is covered by a deep ocean." Then, how do you even know what land is?" Percy couldn't help but wonder. The boy appeared dumbfounded for a moment, seemingly stunned by the stupidity of Percy's question. How else? Naturally, our visitors share stories of their home worlds. Enki spoke matter-of-factly, as if he was explaining something obvious to a toddler. "Visitors?" This was Percy's turn to be shocked, however. "You're telling me you have regular contact with other races?" "Of course. Did you think we're some bottom-water savages?" The boy rolled his eyes. "Well, okay. They don't visit remote places like this town. We don't have the proper infrastructure to host a land dweller here," he clarified, though Percy was still confused. Every world he'd been on that had some relationship with a foreign race, it was always one of hostility. That remained true whether it was Remir, Huehue, or the Vault of Magic. Other than the races which banded together, probably temporarily, to conquer Mickey's world. This was the first time he'd heard of two civilizations cooperating peacefully. "I call BS," Percy insisted. "I've been to plenty of places, and the one thing they all have in common is they'd rather take what they want by force." Hearing that, Enki grinned. "Ah, I understand the source of your confusion. Well, in our case, that's not on the table. From what I've heard, our military force is practically non-existent, so we couldn't touch another race even if we wanted to. And we also have something way too valuable for others to risk harming us. Why wouldn't they just take it if you can't even defend yourselves? Well, they could, in theory, but that would just be a waste. You see, they wouldn't be as good at utilizing our resources as we are, so it's better for everyone involved if we sell our superior products for a fair price. At this point, Percy had plenty of questions, but he figured his status might be able to answer a few of them. Undersir. Enki, Percival's clone. Mana cores. Mana core 1, red, fire. Mana core 2, seed. Spectral trait. Weaving. Spells. Phantom scale gauntlet, refined. Spectral art. Soul stitching, refined. Soul harvester, refined. Reinforcement, refined. Mantle of deceit, refined. Decrees. Phoebe's decree grants access to your status. Morai's decree, incomplete. Grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life mana to germinate. Metatron's decree. Open a one-way portal to the Vault of Magic at will. Undersir. Wait, what? Enki drew a sharp breath. How do you have EA's gift? Chapter 178. Alchemic Principles. EA's gift? What's that? Percy asked. Are you kidding me? The thing you just made pop up right in front of our eyes. Thinking of something, Percy's heart skipped a beat. But he didn't show it. He wanted to pry some more information from his host first. We call this thing a status. Everyone has it where I'm from. All of them. You mean, for free? Don't you have to pass the brewing test first? Brewing test? Percy struggled to contain his excitement. This was getting better and better. Did these people have some sort of alchemy-based version of Phoebe's decree? If so, he had to get his hands on that, whatever it took. Yes. Enki confirmed, oblivious to Percy's inner turmoil. Why would you even need EA's gift if you can't brew a simple potion? Percy considered explaining that Phoebe's decree probably had a different purpose to what they used their version for, but he was more curious about something else. I'm guessing this EA guy is one of your gods? The boy appeared taken aback by Percy's question, almost insulted even. The Holy One isn't just one of our gods. Enki protested rather animatedly. He's the one who invented the supreme art, allowing Atlantis to flourish. All our gods look up to him. All right, I get it already. Percy rolled his eyes. Kid, please tell me it's your lifelong dream to become an alchemist, and you've spent the last 10 years of your life preparing for the test. Enki tilted his head. Why would I say such a thing? Of course I'd like to become an alchemist. Who wouldn't? It's the greatest honor for one of our people. But getting into this profession is expensive. Not something a red-born orphan could afford. Hell, I can't even buy the pills to cleanse my core. He smiled bitterly. Hearing that, Percy felt his heart clench. It was only now he realized just how much he and his host had in common. And you're just going to give up like that? I'll have you know, I started off in a similar place myself. Still, the thought of surrendering to my fate never once crossed my mind. Did it work out for you? Enki asked, some hope seeping into his voice. What grade have you reached? Like a needle stab. The boy's question caused Percy to deflate a little. Well, on paper I'm still at orange, he said, trying to mask his embarrassment. But I'm getting dangerously close to yellow. And I've even defeated a green in single combat before. He hurriedly added upon seeing Enki frown. The boy remained silent for a few moments, seemingly contemplating Percy's words. Even if that's true, I'm guessing it has something to do with your strange ability to possess people. That's just cheating, he said, though he seemed to catch himself a second later. Sorry, I didn't mean it like it's a bad thing. It's great that you have this option, but I've got nothing like that. Just a useless fire affinity. What are you talking about? Percy asked, a smile tugging at his lips. You've got the greatest cheat in the universe, right at your fingertips. And what's that? The boy asked. Me, Percy exclaimed. The boy didn't seem convinced, however. How exactly can you help me? I'll have you know that, amongst my many talents, I am first and foremost a master alchemist. In fact, my main body is currently on the run from multiple gods back home, each of them eagerly yearning for my wisdom. Arnov, so, can you brew a lesser regeneration pill? The boy asked. Percy scratched the back of their head. This story originates from a different website. Ensure the author gets the support they deserve by reading it there. Well, I've never encountered that particular recipe before, but how hard could it be? Just find me a book, or 10 on the topic, and I'll get us both that gift thingy in no time. Apparently, Enki's orphanage did have a library. Even better, it contained a few books on alchemy. Though, seeing their condition, Percy wasn't surprised his host hadn't thought it possible to teach himself the basics. He held a stack of loose sheets, trying to rearrange them into the correct order. The blurred page numbers weren't making his job easy. Only 3 books, and one of them is missing half the pages, he groaned. For an entire world that seemed to survive by selling alchemical products to outsiders, their libraries were surprisingly poor. Even the guild's library had been in a better state. Then again, this might not be the fairest comparison. The Alchemists Guild was the central hub for all alchemists on Remir, whereas this was just some random library in an orphanage in some remote town. I thought you already knew how to brew stuff. What's the hold-up? Enki asked. Well, I'm great at brewing elixirs, not regeneration pills, or whatever you called them. Percy explained. I'm sure some of the principles are transferable, but I'd still need to study the ingredients and methodology involved. Methodology? Yes. The tools and procedures aside, I've never done this underwater before. The two remained silent in the library for several hours, as Percy tried to make sense of the alien books. Their pages weren't made of paper, apparently, but some slightly oily pieces of parchment, crafted out of some creature's skin. Every now and then, Enki grew hungry or bored or probably both, asking him to take a short break to grab a quick snack from his room. It was some kind of pink roe stored in a sealed bowl. It tasted quite nice too, its rich, salty flavor reminding Percy of a cross between crab sticks and eggs. In any case, despite the semi-frequent interruptions and the poor condition of his reading material, Percy did manage to piece together an overview of the locals' alchemic ways. Their main product, the thing they exported to their trade partners, were some cultivation pills that didn't differ much from the elixirs on Remir. They were made from some kind of amber pearls, a local ingredient rich in stable beast mana, not unlike the nectar the starry wasps produced. I don't think the cultivation pills will be very useful for me, Percy grimaced. He had no idea how the lifespans and advancement speed of the natives compared to a human's, but their potential seemed to be confined within the same range as theirs. In other words, redborns here could only ever make it to yellow, orangeborns to blue, and so on, just like on Remir. Suffice to say, it probably meant the pills weren't much better than elixirs. However, that was not to say there was nothing to be gained here. What set the locals apart was precisely EA's gift that Enki had mentioned. Percy assumed it was a decree. It had to be, and it was the reason other races didn't dare to touch Atlantis. Apparently, this decree was a lot more proactive than Phoebe's, directly affecting an alchemist's ability, allowing them to greatly increase their alchemic yield. As for how exactly it achieved that, these books didn't say, but Percy guessed it had something to do with the weird glowing eyes he'd seen on some of the natives earlier. Can I even get the decree, though? He wasn't a native, which should automatically disqualify him based on everything he'd read. Then again, he was currently inhabiting the body of a local, so maybe he could trick whatever mechanism was responsible for disseminating the decree. At the very least, it had worked with the Morais, so it was worth a shot. Beyond that, there was also the question of whether this decree could even stack with the one he already had. Would he have to carry 2 separate statuses from now on? Or could they merge? He shrugged. I suppose there's only one way to answer all those questions. But first, I need to turn the kid into an alchemist. Luckily, the books hadn't been entirely useless on that front. Cross-referencing the gist of their contents with his own expertise, Percy had been able to discern a few important details about the locals' branch of alchemy. Apparently, many of the central concepts carried over from one world to another, and even from one product to another. Whether he was brewing an elixir, a potion, or a pill, and whether they were on Remir or Atlantis, similar techniques were involved. When brewing cleansing resources in particular, the so-called 3 pillars of alchemy, pacification, redirection, and deattunement were paramount. The people of Atlantis referred to them as alchemic principles and had their own name for each of them, but Percy could tell they were functionally the same. After all, beast mana always had to be handled in the same manner. But this book mentions more than 3 principles. There was one Percy had chosen to translate as extraction. It involved separating and condensing an ingredient's properties, which was more relevant when brewing potions and potion-adjacent products, as other affinities weren't as potent as beast mana, and needed to undergo this procedure to become usable. In fact, Percy was almost certain they had this back home too. It was probably the missing knowledge about potion-making that he'd never had the chance to study. And it was also the very thing he needed to master and teach Enki, if he wanted to get his hands on that decree. Well, any progress? The boy asked after noticing Percy had stopped reading for a while. Enki had tried not to sound too eager, but he'd done a poor job keeping his excitement from spilling through their bond. A little. I'm going to have to play around a bit to figure it out, but the basic idea isn't too different to the things I've studied in the past. Really? You mean there's actually a chance we can do this? Hold your seahorses, kid, Percy said. We'll need lots of ingredients to practice with, and I have no clue where to get them. Do you have any idea where we can find fast-growing moss, Croacoa pincers, or Beliman tears? Do we need all of that? Enki asked. No, they're interchangeable. Any one of them should do. But we'll need at least a dozen batches. Probably more. The boy remained silent for a bit, seemingly considering it. Eventually, he spoke. I don't even know what a Beliman is, and you can forget about Croacoas too. They are blue beasts. Besides, there aren't any around here. Percy frowned, thinking this wasn't going to work. Yet, his host rekindled his hope a moment later. But, remember that marble reef I mentioned? The place has enough fast-growing moss to last us forever. Chapter 179, Marble Reef. Percy felt the temperature go up rapidly. As the red glow in the distance intensified, the very water around him vibrating. Apparently, that light he'd seen the other day was an underwater volcano, and an active one at that. From what Enki explained, his people tended to build their towns and cities in similar locations all around Atlantis, settling as close to the volcanoes as they safely could. These were their main sources of heat, and also food, as they attracted marine life of all shapes and sizes. This particular volcano was called Samo, and its eruptions lasted a couple hours at a time, interspaced in regular intervals around 5 times longer than that, according to Percy's estimates. This was how the townsfolk kept track of time, though each region on Atlantis had to rely on a different system. If you're done staring at the lava, we should get going while it's still bright. Enki rolled his eyes. Hey, I know you're used to it, but this is quite a novel experience for an outsider. Percy protested. The boy shrugged, before swimming towards the marble reef they'd seen the day before. They hoped to make it there while the eruption was still underway, as the extra light would help them in their search. If they missed it, it would just make their life harder until the next one. Say, are you sure those eels are rare? Percy suddenly asked. As he'd come to learn, Enki was a rather fearless kid. He didn't seem scared to return to the reef in the slightest, almost as if he hadn't nearly died there just yesterday. In fact, Percy had to force him to ask the caregiver at the orphanage to lend him more of the antidote, in case they got bitten again. After some placating, the lady had begrudgingly agreed, though a single dose wouldn't help much if the place was teeming with the creatures. Geez, will you stop nagging me about that already? Enki scoffed. I've been playing there my whole life. This is the first time this happened. Percy wasn't entirely convinced, but he did let go. After all, he wasn't the kid's dad, nor would he be able to babysit him forever anyway. Eventually, the two reached the undersea forest, diving into the dense embrace of the corals. The dim glow of the volcano looked even scarier from within, as the scant rays of crimson danced against the deep shadows of the reef itself, both clawing at Enki from every direction. Suffice to say, Percy's heart skipped a beat whenever a small creature jumped in front of them, much to his host's dismay. "Can you not get spooked by every little thing? It might have been funny if we weren't sharing a body." The boy groaned. "Have you seen how creepy most of these things are?" Percy asked, though some heat still gathered in his cheeks. "I'd be a lot less scared if you could actually defend yourself." As embarrassing as it was to be called a coward by a kid, he didn't think Enki fully appreciated how unsettling this experience was for a land-dweller. Percy was essentially swimming at the bottom of an alien ocean, his only company being a red-cord kid who couldn't light a candle to save his life. And it only got more frightening once the eruption finally died down, plunging their surroundings into complete darkness. "Look, I get it," Enki acknowledged. "But nothing besides the eels is even capable of hurting us." "Ah, silly me. We've only got the eels with the deadly venom to worry about." "How reassuring." Percy rolled his eyes. In the end, the two continued their search in silence, this time relying on mana sense to locate their target. The good news was that the fast-growing moss they needed was a mana-rich ingredient, so it shouldn't be too difficult to spot, even like this. Of course, mana sense couldn't help with navigating the maze-like interior of the reef itself. The corals didn't contain much mana, making them practically invisible in their sixth sense. Consequently, Enki bumped his head against the hard structures a few too many times for his liking. Not to mention that the moss they were looking for wasn't the only thing containing mana nearby, which meant they'd wasted a fair amount of time on false positives. Reading on Amazon or a pirate site. This novel is from Royal Road. Support the author by reading it there. "I think this must be it," Enki eventually said. "That's exactly what you said the previous 20 times. Percy grunted, but still carefully examined the area beneath their feet. They were floating inside a ring-shaped section of corals, a blanket of orange coating both their inner walls and the crater's floor. This was already a good sign, as that was precisely the moss's natural mana grade. Even better, the chaotic pattern via which the substance spread over the coral also matched the description somewhat. "How long until the next eruption?" Percy asked. "We're not even halfway there," the boy replied. The darkness made it difficult to verify this was indeed the ingredient they were after. In theory, they could wait a few more hours for the volcano to light their surroundings, but Percy had a quicker method at his disposal. Taking control of the body, he swam closer to the wall, unsheathing a knife strapped to their skirt. Next, he carefully stabbed into the substance at an angle, peeling a layer out. Its texture was definitely soft enough, though there was an even better way to confirm it. "Ew! What are you doing?" Enki protested as Percy grabbed a handful of the slimy goo, plastering it over their stomach. "Just shut up. If this is indeed the moss we want, you'll be getting a lot more than a free alchemy lesson." As their name implied, the lesser regeneration pills they needed to brew weren't that different from the healing potions he was familiar with. Sure, they were solid objects rather than liquids, and they worked by enhancing one's natural regeneration rather than healing them directly. Still, their primary component was still rich in life mana. And indeed, the seed of their second core awakened from its deep slumber mere moments later, seemingly realizing what a tantalizing feast had been laid before it. Without delay, it pulled at the substance greedily, the orange color of the moss soon seeping into their skin. As soon as it reached the center of the vortex, it vanished entirely, leaving nothing but inactive sludge on Enki's belly. What? Where did the mana go?" the boy asked, though Percy replied with a question of his own. "How much moss do you think we can find? We'll need at least 8 to 10 patches of this size. Maybe more." Whether he wanted to or not, Percy would have to repair the boy's second core before they could even start working on the pills. After all, handling the ingredient would be a pain in the ass if the ethereal organ kept sucking the mana dry. Luckily, Enki nodded. "That shouldn't be a problem. This place is over a dozen times as large as my town and the moss is quite common. It might take some time, but we'll definitely find enough if we keep looking." Receiving a positive answer, Percy then unstrapped a large pouch from his waist. Next, he scraped more moss from the coral, stuffing it into the pouch with his knife. He took care not to let it touch his skin. It wasn't like he didn't trust Enki, but he wanted to save some just in case they emptied out the reef before the second core was complete. Brewing without repairing the decree wasn't going to be pleasant. He'd have to wear gloves or something. But it was better than missing out on EA's gift. Only after the pouch was full of moss did he seal it shut with a piece of string they'd brought along. Then, the two took turns harvesting as much of the substance as they could, feeding the boy's decree. The laborious task lasted several hours, neither of them finding it particularly enjoyable. By the time they were done, Samo had erupted thrice more, and they'd also had to look for several more moss-covered areas. Still, the seed was eventually satiated, the second core taking form. Even more notably, Percy overcame his initial unease over the bizarre environment at some point. As strange as it had appeared at first, he understood by now it was just Atlantis's equivalent of the Whistling Woods. Probably even safer than that, actually. So, you're telling me I have 2 mana cores now? Enki asked. Naturally, Percy had already brought the boy up to speed over the last couple of days. The kid had found the news difficult to accept, though Percy didn't miss the wave of excitement seeping through the bond. Yes, but don't try activating it just yet. Why not? It's dangerous if people find out about it. I'll sew you something to hide it as soon as we return to town. At any rate, they'd already collected what they came here for. In the end, they hadn't even run into another eel, as Enki was more than happy to keep reminding Percy. Following his instructions, the boy swam upwards to extricate himself from the suffocating embrace of the corals. Only once he was floating above the reef did he turn towards the town, shooting towards it at top speed, eager to play with his new toy. Truth be told, Percy was just as excited to return to the orphanage, looking forward to practicing with the moss. Leaving EA's gift aside, studying the fundamentals of potion making was something he'd already wanted to delve into. His current plan was to spend the next few weeks guiding Enki into awakening the new core. At the same time, he'd try wrapping his head around the locals' alchemy. And as soon as he mastered the extraction principle, it would finally be time to take the test. And hopefully earn a brand new decree for our efforts. Chapter 180. Extraction. Crafting a bandage for Enki hadn't been too difficult. The concealment rune didn't have any special requirement. It worked with pretty much any material that contained some mana. Visiting the town's marketplace, they only had to beg a few hunters and gatherers for some scraps of mana-rich ingredients, until they collected enough fibers for Percy to do his thing. Between his weaving trait and his growing skill with rune crafting, sewing the enchantment on a long piece of parchment was a piece of cake. Though it did mean Enki would have to pull his skirt a few inches higher to keep the bandage hidden. I look ridiculous. Yeah, well, suck it up. You have a second core now. Percy rolled his eyes. Does that mean I can finally use it? Sure, as soon as you open up your channels. So just focus on that for the next couple of weeks, and leave me alone to study. I'll need to concentrate if you want EA's gift too. Returning to the orphanage, Percy rummaged through the kitchen for whatever tools he could salvage. Naturally, he couldn't afford a proper alchemy kit, so he'd have to make do with common cooking utensils. Being underwater and everything, the local alchemists couldn't use a regular cauldron to heat up the ingredients, as everything would just float away. Consequently, they typically used an airtight container, made of a transparent glass-like material so that they could still observe the reaction happening within. Sadly, there's nothing like that here, Percy smiled bitterly. The best he'd found was a metallic, spherical pot. The top half could be twisted on and off, allowing him to replace the tool he needed to an extent. Still, it was opaque, which meant he wouldn't be able to peer inside it with anything other than his mana sense. Suffice to say, he wasn't looking forward to brewing blindly. And that wasn't the only issue. The actual tool was supposed to contain a few enchantments, such as one for controlling its internal heat, one for the pressure, and one for steering the ingredients. Percy had never learnt the corresponding runes, so he'd have to reproduce everything using Enki's fire mana. It can't be helped, he shrugged. My brewing yield should be plenty anyway. Putting the Aurora Dew aside, Percy estimated his yield with the regular elixirs should have already reached about 32% after brewing for thousands of hours over the past few years. And that was while going through all three of the familiar steps. Luckily, potions and potion-adjacent products appeared much simpler, many of them only requiring a single step, the very extraction principle he was trying to learn. He guessed some of the more complicated recipes like the rejuvenation potions they had in the guild involved more than that, as they contained multiple mana types. But that wasn't the case for the lesser regeneration pills. Percy only needed to gather and condense the moss's properties into a solid. That was it. Suffice to say, his yield would have been over 68% if he was more familiar with the principle and the recipe, and if he was to do this on Remir using his own tools. Naturally, his yield would take a massive hit due to all the additional obstacles he had to overcome. Still, according to the textbook, a 20% yield was enough to condense a single pill, which was incidentally the requirement to pass the test. Just 20%. Less than a third of what I'm normally capable of. I should be able to do it in a reasonable amount of time. Unfortunately for Percy, reality didn't quite match his expectations. While the books he'd found in the library had vaguely outlined the pill's recipe, they didn't go into specifics. After exhausting the entire stash they'd brought back from the reef, he had yet to even determine the correct dosage of moss for each attempt. Love this story? Find the genuine version on the author's preferred platform and support their work. Percy was by no means a novice in brewing, but blindly tossing a random amount of the ingredient, mixed with salt water, into the sphere was never going to work. At least, not unless they burned through way more materials than this. Thinking of something, Percy left the orphanage, roaming the town in search of people with the strange glow in their eyes. If his guess was correct, that was a side effect of EA's gift, which meant that all those people were qualified alchemists. The sheer number of them was insane compared to what they had on Remir. Then again, it wasn't that strange considering Atlantis survived by exporting their products to outsiders. In any case, Percy approached as many of the suspected alchemists as he could find, begging them for tips and tricks to solve whatever issue he was facing, one question at a time. Inhabiting a kid's body definitely helped a lot with that, eliciting a fair amount of kindness from the strangers. Alright, so I'm supposed to only fill it about halfway with moss. Is that how they prevent the salt from messing with the recipe? Ah, I hadn't even thought of flipping the sphere's rotation to stir the contents. Naturally, he asked Enki to take a break from his own task many a time, helping him retrieve more moss from the reef whenever he ran out. The boy complained, engrossed in activating his new core as he was, but still helped Percy out. Alfoyo. It wasn't until around 3 weeks later that Percy managed to make some tangible progress, however. He hadn't condensed a complete pill just yet, but this was the first time the moss's essence wasn't wasted entirely, leaving behind a few usable dregs inside. This is less than a 5% yield though, he grimaced. At this rate, it would take him months to hit his target, which was something he had to avoid at all costs, not wanting to keep his main body waiting longer than necessary. At least, there wasn't a timer looming over his head with regards to Enki's condition, as the boy had healed almost completely by now. In fact, Percy had been forced to manually keep some of the injuries open, so that he wouldn't get kicked out of the body prematurely. Percy! It's done! Enki exclaimed one day. Took you long enough. Percy rolled his eyes. I only needed a week to fill up my second core the first time around. Yeah, well, I'm terrible with magic. I've never really practiced since learning about my fire affinity, the boy said, a sheepish grin plastered all over his face. Fair enough. Let's see it then. Try pulling some mana from your core. Following his instructions, Enki soon began to gather some mana in his hand, though that didn't last for long. As soon as he started, Percy took over, recognizing the feel of the mana instantly. While he hadn't paid much attention to his host's efforts over the past few weeks, there was no mistaking these channels, as they were the exact same ones branching out of his own abdomen back home. Undersir. Mana cores. Mana core 1, red, fire. Mana core 2, red, pure. Undersir. Really? Enki asked, disappointment evident in his tone. My first affinity is fire, And the second one pure? Percy felt a little bad hearing the boy. Enki. My second core has a pure affinity too. It's not as bad as people say. I've learned quite a few nifty tricks with it too. Can you teach me? Enki asked with some hope in his eyes, though that only added a pang of guilt to Percy's pity. It wasn't like he hadn't considered teaching the boy circulation or crystallization, but they didn't have the time for either. It would take years to hone Enki's body enough for the former. As for the latter, it would be even tougher for him than it had been for Percy without a boosting art to fall back to. Maybe next time we meet, he ultimately said, watching the boy deflate. But it's not all bad news. I think your new affinity might just help me solve the issue I've been having with the pills. While Percy could heat up the sphere with his fire mana and stir it by rotating it, he had no answer for the internal pressure. He couldn't use his fire mana for that, as it would only mess with the moss, burning it. Consequently, he'd been working with a massive handicap, as he could only control 2 of the 3 main variables. That said, pure mana was a lot less reactive than fire mana. Not to mention how much better he could control it. By injecting some into the reaction, he could probably apply as much pressure as he wanted, improving far more rapidly than before. If he got lucky, he might even reach his target within the next couple of weeks. Enki. Even with EA's gift and a second core, it doesn't mean your life will be smooth sailing. Hell, I found a dozen amazing things in my travels and I still have to fight every single day, Percy said, before continuing. I can't give you all the answers, but I can give you the tools to figure them out for yourself after I'm gone.